The sky over Mill Haven, Wyoming, was the kind of blue that made people believe the world was a fair place. Wide, cloudless, indifferent. It was the sort of morning that had no business hosting a catastrophe, and yet there Eliza Rowan stood in the doorway of the First Methodist Church, her bouquet trembling in both hands, her smile beginning to crack at the corners in ways she could not control and could not hide. Reverend Aldous had already cleared his throat twice. The organ had stopped playing somewhere during the second chorus of the processional, the way music does when the musician realizes the moment is past, and nobody wants to acknowledge it out loud. The pews were full. Every woman who had ever attended one of her mother's sewing circles, every man who had done business with her father before he died, every child dragged to the ceremony because their parents thought witnessing a wedding was educational, all of them watching, all of them beginning to understand something that Eliza herself refused to accept. "He's probably just late," whispered Margaret Hooper from the first pew, the way a person says something they already know isn't true. Eliza's maid of honor, her cousin Patrice, was standing beside her with a fixed smile that had stopped reaching her eyes 20 minutes ago. Patrice had the particular skill of keeping her face composed when everything was collapsing. She'd developed it growing up in a household with a difficult father, and she was using every ounce of that skill now. "He's coming," Eliza said quietly, to herself mostly, but her eyes kept moving to the church doors, to the road beyond, to the empty space where a horse and rider should have appeared by now, where Warren Aldgate, her fiancé of 14 months, the man she had reorganized her entire future around, should have been standing with his hat in his hands, and his dark hair slicked back, and that particular smile of his that she had once thought was confidence, and was only now beginning to suspect might have been something else entirely. The clock on the wall of the church read 11:47. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 11. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. A child asked its mother a question that the mother answered in a hiss, so sharp it carried halfway down the aisle. Reverend Aldous approached her with the careful movements of a man diffusing something. He was 60 years old, and he had officiated over enough human wreckage to know when a situation had passed the point of no return, even if the people inside it hadn't caught up yet. "Miss Rowan," he said gently, "perhaps we should—" "Give him 5 more minutes," she said. Aldous paused. He looked at her the way you look at someone standing too close to the edge of something. Of course, 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then Patrice's husband appeared at the back of the church, and the look on his face when he caught Patrice's eye, that particular look of a man who has just learned something ugly and doesn't know how to carry it into a room full of people, was the moment Eliza felt the floor shift beneath her. She watched Patrice cross to her husband, watched them whisper, watched Patrice's hand come up to cover her mouth, and she knew. She knew before Patrice turned around, knew before she crossed back down the aisle with her composed face gone, replaced by something raw and sorry and furious all at once. Knew in that way a person sometimes knows terrible things before they're told, the body understanding what the mind refuses. "Liza," Patrice said quietly, taking both her hands. "He's gone." The word didn't land right away. It sat there between them, incomplete. "Gone," Eliza repeated. "What do you mean, gone?" "Thomas rode out to check the Aldgate property this morning." Patrice's voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "Warren left last night. Him and 2 horses and everything in that lockbox he kept under the floorboards. Thomas says the neighbors saw him heading south on the Cheyenne Road before midnight." Eliza stared at her. "He left," she said. "Yes." "He left last night." "Yes." Which meant that while she had been lying awake in her childhood bedroom, too nervous to sleep, going over the words of her vows in her head, pressing the dress she'd be married in for the second time because she wanted it to be perfect. While all of that was happening, Warren Aldgate had been saddling 2 horses and riding away from everything he had promised her. He had not even told her to her face. The church had gone completely silent. 200 people who had just understood what Eliza was only now processing. She became very aware, in that moment, of the weight of the dress. White cotton and eyelet lace, hand-stitched by her mother over 4 months of Sunday afternoons, every seam a small act of love. She became aware of the flowers in her hands, yellow roses and sprigs of lavender that Warren had said were her colors, though she'd never thought of herself as having colors before he said it. She became aware of her own face, exposed and observed, and of the particular cruelty of having the worst moment of your life witnessed by everyone you have ever known. She did not cry. She thought she might, felt the pressure of it behind her eyes and in her throat. But something else moved through her first, something harder and colder and less forgiving than grief. And it held. She handed the bouquet to Patrice with a steady hand. "Tell them I'm sorry for the inconvenience," she said. "Liza, you don't have to—" "Tell them." She said it quietly, but in a way that left no room for argument. She walked back down the aisle. 200 people watched her do it, and not one of them said a word. The silence was the worst part. Worse than whispers would have been. Worse than murmuring. Silence meant they were all thinking the same thing, and none of them were brave enough to say it. And what they were thinking was, what did she do wrong? What did she miss? How does a woman get to 11:47 on her wedding day before she finds out the man is already gone? She walked through the doors of the church, into the Wyoming morning, into the blue sky that had no business being so beautiful. She walked for a long time without thinking about where she was going. This is a thing that happens to people in shock. The body keeps moving because stopping requires a decision, and decisions require a mind that is currently unavailable. Her shoes were not built for walking. They were built for standing at an altar and then sitting at a table and then dancing, if there was dancing, which there was not going to be. The heels caught on every uneven patch of ground, and the lace hem of the dress dragged through the dust of the road, and acquired a brown stain along the bottom that spread as she walked. She didn't care about the dress. She didn't care about much of anything right now. There was a kind of numbness that had settled over her. Not peaceful, not calm, but the way a person goes numb in extreme cold. The feeling was still there underneath, waiting. She knew it would come back. She had enough experience with her own heart to know that this particular quiet was borrowed time. Millhaven sat in a broad valley between two ridges, and the road out of town ran north past Calloway's mill and then curved west through open scrubland before rising into the hills beyond. Eliza had walked this road 100 times as a girl, had known every rut and stone and bend of it, had come out here when she needed to think, or when the house got too loud, or when her father was in one of his moods and the walls felt like they were closing in. She was walking it now without deciding to, just following the instinct that set away without specifying a destination. The June sun was climbing. The scrubland smelled of dust and sage and something faintly sweet she had never been able to identify. Her feet hurt. The dress was developing more stains. She became aware, somewhere around the second mile, that she had not eaten anything since dinner the night before because she'd been too nervous, and that hunger was beginning to make itself known beneath the numbness. She sat down on a rock beside the road. The rock was hot from the sun. Her dress billowed around her in a way that felt ridiculous. All that white fabric spread across the dry Wyoming earth. She looked at her hands, the left one with the engagement ring that Warren had given her, a modest band with a small garnet center stone that she had loved because it wasn't pretentious. She pulled it off, held it in her palm for a moment. Then she set it on the rock beside her and looked at it sitting there in the sunlight. She thought about Warren, tried to figure out when she should have known. There had been signs. She could see them clearly now, in the way you can only see things clearly after you no longer have a reason to look away. The way he had grown quieter in the last few weeks. The way certain questions about the future made him change the subject. The way he had a habit of looking at exits when he walked into a room, a thing she had found charming once, and now understood differently. She had not wanted to see it. That was the worst part. Not that he'd deceived her. She could be angry about that, would be angry about that, was already beginning to be angry. The worst part was the suspicion that she had helped him deceive her, had smoothed over the rough edges, had told herself the story she wanted to hear because she was 26 years old and tired of waiting for her life to start. "You look like you could use some water." The voice came from the road. She looked up. A man on horseback had stopped about 20 feet away, and she had been so deep inside her own head that she hadn't heard him approach. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, she guessed, thick through the shoulders, with gray starting at his temples and in the stubble along his jaw. He was dressed in the practical, unadorned way of a working man, dark trousers, worn boots, a shirt that had been washed many times. His hat was pulled low against the sun, and he was regarding her with an expression that was not pity and not curiosity exactly, but something practical. Assessing. He had a canteen on his saddle. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her, at the wedding dress, at the ring on the rock, at the tear in the hem, and said nothing for a moment. All right, he said. He didn't turn away, but he also didn't push. He just sat there on his horse like a man who was in no particular hurry and had no particular agenda. I said I was fine, she repeated. I heard you. A pause. You don't look fine. She almost laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, not quite a laugh at all. No, she agreed. I don't suppose I do. He reached for the canteen and held it out. Not coming closer, just extending his arm, leaving it up to her. She looked at it, then at him. Then she stood up and crossed to the road and took it, and drank more deeply than she'd intended. The water was warm, but it didn't matter. She handed it back. Thank you, she said. Cade Mercer, he said, not offering his hand, just his name. Eliza Rowan. He nodded slowly. The Rowan girl. He said it like he was placing her. Your father sold my father cattle years ago. Good man. He was. A pause. Where are you headed? He asked. It was a reasonable question. She had no answer. She looked back up the road, in the direction she'd been walking, and realized she had no destination. She had been walking away from something, not toward anything, and eventually a way runs out. I'm not sure, she said honestly. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ring on the rock. You're not going back to town, he said. It was not a question. Not today. I thought about that. She could see him thinking, not the rapid, twitchy thinking of someone making a calculation, but the slower, more deliberate kind. Like a man who had learned not to speak until he knew what he meant. I've got a ranch about 4 miles north, he said. Mercer Ridge. I need someone who can cook and manage a household. My housekeeper left 2 months ago, and the place has gone to hell. He said this without embarrassment, as a plain statement of fact. I can offer you room, board, and a wage. The work is real work. I won't pretend it isn't. She stared at him. You're offering me a job, she said. I'm offering you a place to stand, he said, while you figure out the rest. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked back toward Mill Haven, at the distant smudge of buildings and smoke in the valley, and thought about what waited for her there. Her mother's house, where she would have to walk back through the door and explain. The looks in town that would follow her to the mercantile and the post office and church and every other place she'd been known all her life. The conversations that would stop when she entered a room. The people who would be kind in ways that were worse than cruelty. She picked the ring up off the rock, held it once more, then put it in her pocket. 4 miles. 4 miles, she said. About that. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them flinched. All right, Mr. Mercer, she said. Show me where I'm standing. Mercer Ridge was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something rougher, she supposed, given the state of the man who owned it. A lean-to, maybe, or a collection of buildings that leaned on each other for support. Something provisional, like an afterthought. What she found instead was a proper ranch. A large house of weathered timber and stone with a covered porch that wrapped around the front. And one side, 3 outbuildings in varying states of repair. A barn that was solid even if the roof needed work. And beyond all of it, the wide Wyoming sky pressing down on land that went farther than she could easily see. The Mercer property ran up into the hills to the west and spread across the valley floor to the east. And even in her current state, she could see that it was substantial. It was also, as Cade had said, a mess. Not dangerous. Not uninhabitable. But the kind of mess that accumulates when a working household loses the person responsible for its daily functioning. Dishes that had been washed but not properly put away. A kitchen that needed a thorough cleaning. Laundry in a pile that had been moved more than once. Windows that hadn't been opened in weeks. A general air of a place maintained by people who knew how to do hard physical work, but had not mastered the smaller domestic tasks that keep a home from going feral. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. I know, Cade said behind her. It's fine, she said. I've seen worse. This was not entirely true, but it was the kind of thing you say. There was a boy of about 14 sitting at the kitchen table eating cold cornbread, who looked up when they came in with the frank appraisal of a young person who hasn't yet learned to be polite about staring. He had Cade's square jaw and his hair was dark and disheveled. This is my son, Eli, Cade said. Hello, Eli. The boy looked her up and down with some interest. She was still wearing the wedding dress, had no other clothes, had walked 4 miles through the Wyoming scrubland in heeled shoes, and said, Are you the new housekeeper? Appears so. Did something happen to your dress? Eli, Cade said, in the tone of a man who uses a single word to mean several things. Eli went back to his cornbread. There was also, she discovered in the following hour, a ranch hand named Amos Birch, who was 40-some years old and had worked the Mercer property for 7 years, and who regarded her arrival with the specific wariness of a man who has seen housekeepers come and go and has learned not to trust the arrangement to last. He was polite in a careful way. Yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and thank you, ma'am. But his eyes held the honest skepticism of a person who was still deciding whether to bother. There were 2 other hands, younger men, brothers named Pete and Carl Dorsey, who were the opposite of Amos, easy, curious, and not particularly concerned with what her arrival meant for anything. Pete shook her hand and said, "You're wearing a wedding dress." "I'm aware." "Something happened?" "Pete," Amos said, the same way Cade had said his son's name. Pete shrugged, but let it go. By evening, she had assessed the kitchen, made a list in her head of what needed to be done and in what order, cooked a dinner from the available supplies that was simple but hot, beans and salt pork and cornbread, the same cornbread that Eli had been eating cold, and served it to 5 people at a table that she had wiped down twice. She changed out of the wedding dress before dinner. Kate had found her a plain cotton dress that had belonged to someone. She didn't ask who, and it was too large and the color wasn't flattering, and she put it on without complaint. She folded the wedding dress with more care than she expected to feel, smoothed the lace, set it on the shelf of the room he'd given her. She sat down at the table with the others and ate in silence for a while. "You didn't have to eat with us," Cade said, not unkindly. "Some housekeepers prefer—" "I prefer to eat at a table," she said, "if that's all right." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded. "That's fine." Eli watched her eat with the unfiltered attention of a boy his age, cataloging her. She could feel it. After a while, he said, "My father said something happened to you this morning." "Eli," Cade began. "It did," Eliza said simply. "But I'd rather not talk about it at dinner." The boy considered this. "All right," he said, and went back to his beans. It was the most anyone said for the rest of the meal. After the dishes were done and the kitchen put in something approaching order, Eliza went to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall for a while. The room was small. A single window that faced the barn. A wooden chair. A washstand with a cracked basin. She took the garnet ring out of her pocket, held it, thought about everything she'd thought she was going to have by now. She was 26 years old. She had a mother who was probably half out of her mind with worry and shame back in Mill Haven. She had no money of her own, no home, no plan. She was wearing a dead woman's dress. She'd figured that part out during dinner. And sleeping in a bare room on a ranch she'd arrived at this morning in the wreckage of a wedding that hadn't happened. She thought about crying. Then she thought, not yet. She set the ring on the washstand. She laid down on top of the covers in the too large dress and stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the Wyoming night. The wind moving through the grass, a horse moving in the barn, the distant call of something she couldn't identify. The sounds of a place that had been getting along without her and would get along without her, and had no particular opinion about her presence. There was something almost restful about that. She slept. She had been at Mercer Ridge for 3 days when she found the letters. She wasn't snooping, she was cleaning, the kind of thorough cleaning the kitchen and the main rooms desperately needed. And she found them in a drawer of the writing desk in the front room when she was dusting, tucked underneath a ledger. 2 letters, tied with a piece of string, addressed to Cade in a woman's handwriting, careful and precise. The return address was a place called Hartwell, which she didn't recognize. She set them aside immediately, of course. Not her business. She put them on top of the ledger where he'd see them. She didn't read them, but she thought about them. That evening, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Eli was in bed and she was finishing the last of the dishes, Cade came in from the barn. He moved the way men do who have worked physically all their lives. Not graceful, exactly, but economical. Every step going somewhere. He saw the letters on the desk. He stopped. She kept washing the dish in her hand, not looking at him, giving him whatever privacy a person could have in the same room. After a moment he said, "Where did you find these?" "In the drawer, under the ledger. I was cleaning." A pause. "You didn't read them." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "No. All right." He picked them up, held them without opening them. "They're from my sister. She's been after me to sell this place and move to Hartwell." He said it flatly, without particular feeling. "She thinks I've been out here long enough." "Have you?" He looked up. "Sorry," she said. "That's not my business." "No," he said. It's a fair question. He thought about it. I've been out here since I was 22 years old, built this place with my own hands mostly. I don't know what else I'd do. Then you don't have to go. My sister would argue otherwise. Does she have a stake in the ranch? He almost smiled. No. Then her opinion is an opinion. She set the clean dish on the rack. You get to have your own. He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise and might have been recalibration. The look of a person adjusting to something unexpected. You're very direct, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said. No, it's not. He put the letters back on the desk without opening them. She had been there 4 days when Eli came to find her in the kitchen where she was making bread, a thing she hadn't done in years but found herself wanting to do, the physical repetition of it, and sat at the table and watched her work. My mother died, he said, without preamble. She looked up. 2 years ago, he said. Fever. He said it the way 14-year-olds say hard things, blunt, no cushioning, daring you to handle it. I'm sorry, she said. My father doesn't talk about her much. He picked up a piece of the dough she'd trimmed from the edge. She'd let him do it because it kept his hands busy, and worked it between his fingers. Do you think that's because it hurts, or because he's just like that? She thought about this honestly. I think both things can be true at once, she said. Some people get quieter when they're hurt. It's not the same as not hurting. Eli thought about this. You got hurt, he said. It was not cruel, just observational. Yes. Are you going to be quiet about it too? She looked at him for a moment. This boy with his father's jaw and his dead mother's eyes. She didn't know what his mother had looked like, but those eyes belonged to someone. Probably, she said honestly. For a while. He nodded, as if this confirmed something. That's what I thought, he said. Then, the bread smells good. She went back to kneading. Thank you, Eli. She wrote to her mother on the 5th day. It took her 4 attempts to get the letter right. The first 3 were either too apologetic or too defensive or too full of explanations that weren't going to help anything. The 4th one was short. She said she was safe, she was working, she was not coming back to Millhaven yet, and she didn't know when she would, and she was sorry for the worry. She did not say anything about Warren. Her mother would understand the silence on that subject. She rode into town to post it. Cade had offered her the use of a gentle mare named Dusty that was not currently being used for ranch work. And while she was there, she became aware of the particular quality of attention that a place extends to someone who has recently become its subject. Millhaven was not a cruel town. She'd grown up here, knew most of its people, and they were in the main decent. But it was also a small town, and small towns run on information, and Eliza Rowan walking into the post office on a borrowed horse. 5 days after being left at the altar was information. She could feel it. The postmaster, Mr. Hennessy, took her letter with perfect professionalism and said not a word about anything other than postage. Mrs. Calloway from the mill was not so restrained. Eliza. She materialized at the post office door with the particular purposefulness of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this encounter. Honey, how are you? We've all been so worried. I'm fine, Mrs. Calloway. Thank you for asking. Are you staying in town? Where are you staying? Your mother has been beside herself. I've written to her. She'll hear from me soon. She kept moving toward the door. But where are you staying, dear? Somewhere safe. She paused at the door and looked back. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Calloway. It's kind. She said it in a way that closed the conversation. She rode back to Mercer Ridge. Cade was in the yard when she returned, talking to Amos near the gate, and he looked up when she came in. She swung down from Dusty. She was getting better at it, though she was not elegant about it, and handed the reins to Pete, who appeared from somewhere. Town all right? Cade asked. Fine. She paused. People know I'm here. He nodded. He didn't seem surprised. Does that bother you? She asked. The talk? He looked at her steadily. I've been talked about before, he said. I've found it generally does more damage to the people doing the talking than to the subject. That's optimistic. That's experience. He turned back to Amos. Let's walk the north fence this afternoon. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Her kitchen now, in the way that a place becomes yours through work rather than ownership, and felt something shift. Not healing, not resolution, something smaller than those things. The particular small satisfaction of a person who has survived the first terrible stretch of something difficult and is now on the other side of it, not whole, not fine, but standing. She had made herself a promise in those long minutes on the road in the wedding dress, with the blue sky above her, and the scrubland around her and every expected future dissolving. She would not spend her days waiting to feel better. She would work until she did, or until she didn't, and either way she would not be still. She filled the kettle and put it on the stove. She began making a list of things the house still needed. There was a loose hinge on the front door. 3 of the window panes needed cleaning badly enough to affect the light inside. The root cellar needed an inventory. She'd been avoiding the root cellar. The garden that had clearly been someone's project and then been let go needed to be assessed and either reclaimed or honestly abandoned. She added root cellar and garden to her list. Then she added something that had come to her while she was riding back from town, while the wind was in her face and the mare moved steady beneath her. At the bottom of the list, in smaller letters, she wrote, "Learn to shoot." She folded the list and put it in her apron pocket. Outside, she could hear the men moving around the yard, the sound of horses and equipment, and the ordinary working noise of a place that had things to do. In the barn, something moved. One of the horses shifting, she thought. Dusty, or maybe the big bay that Cade rode. She did not know yet what she was building here. She did not know if this was temporary shelter or something that would last. She did not know Cade Mercer well enough to know whether his steadiness was real or a performance, whether the careful distance he kept from her was respect or indifference. She knew the bread she'd baked yesterday had come out well. She knew Eli had eaten 3 pieces. She knew Amos had said, in his careful, measured way, that the kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months. She knew the Wyoming sky at sunrise over these hills was the most purely beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that she had stood at the kitchen window watching it for 15 minutes before she could bring herself to start the fire. It was not much, but it was hers. And in a week that had taken almost everything from her, Eliza Rowan had learned to be careful about throwing away the things that were hers. The list on her apron pocket became the map of her days. She started with the root cellar because it was the thing she'd been avoiding, and she had learned enough about herself to know that the things she avoided were usually the things most worth doing. It was dark down there, and it smelled of earth and old potatoes and something that had gone off weeks ago and needed to be found and removed, and she spent a morning with a lantern and a rag and her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, sorting through what could be kept and what couldn't. When she came up into the light, Amos was passing the cellar doors with a bucket in each hand, and he stopped and looked at her, dirty-faced, hair coming loose, a satisfied expression she wasn't trying to hide. And he said very carefully, "How bad was it?" "Bad enough," she said. "Better now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, the way he nodded at things he'd decided to respect, and continued to the barn. That was the beginning of something with Amos Birch. Not friendship. Not yet, maybe not ever in exactly that form, but a kind of mutual acknowledgement between 2 people who measure others by what they're willing to do rather than what they say. She had understood from the first day that Amos was the one whose opinion mattered most on this ranch, not because he owned it, but because he'd been here longest and worked it hardest, and in practical terms he was the spine of the operation. Win Amos, and you'd won something real. She didn't try to win him. She just kept working. The garden was next, and it was worse than the cellar, in a different way. Someone had put real care into it once. She could see the structure of it, the deliberate placement of beds, the remains of a trellis that had been built to last. Whoever had planted it had known what they were doing and had loved doing it, and then they had stopped, and 2 years of Wyoming weather had moved in without mercy. She didn't know if she could bring it back. She wasn't a gardener, not in any serious way, but she could clear what was dead and turn the soil and see what was underneath. And she did that over 3 evenings after the kitchen work was done, kneeling in the dirt with a hand trowel and working by feel when the light got too low. On the 3rd evening, Cade came and stood at the edge of the garden and watched her for a while. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's not part of what we discussed." "I know. The hands can clear it in an afternoon if you want it gone." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "I don't want it gone." He looked at what she'd uncovered, a section of bed that had good dark soil under the dead growth, and something that might have been an onion set that had survived winter on sheer stubbornness. "Hannah planted that garden," he said. "Hannah." It was the first time she'd heard the name. She understood, from the way he said it, flat, contained, that it was his wife's. "I won't change it," she said. "Just bring it back if I can." He looked at the garden for a moment longer. She watched him decide something. Then he said, "She'd have been glad of that, I think," and turned and went back toward the house. She waited until he was inside before she let herself breathe out. She went back to turning the soil. The first lesson with the rifle happened on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, and it did not go the way she had imagined it would. She had put the item on her list quietly, privately, without telling anyone. She had been thinking about it since the ride back from Mill Haven. Some combination of practical sense and a newer, harder instinct that had started forming since the day of the wedding. She lived on a working ranch in the Wyoming frontier, a woman alone among working men, and she did not know how to defend herself. She had found this condition acceptable for the first 26 years of her life, and she had recently stopped finding it acceptable. She asked Cade about it one morning while he was going over the week's work at the kitchen table. "I'd like to learn to shoot," she said. She said it the way she said most things she'd decided, without apology, without softening. He looked up from his ledger. "A rifle," she said, "or a revolver. Whatever you think is appropriate to start." He watched her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I live here, and I don't know how to use a firearm, and I think I should." "Fair enough," he said. Just that. He went back to the ledger. "Thursday morning, before the heat. There's a spot past the north tree line I use." She'd expected more discussion. An opinion on the subject, or a question about her reasons, or some version of, "Are you sure?" The absence of any of that was, she wasn't sure. Strange, maybe. Or maybe it was simply what it looked like. A man who respected a clear statement of intention. Thursday morning, she met him at the fence line at 6:30, with the sun still low and the air smelling of wet grass. He brought a rifle. A Winchester, she would learn later. The kind of thing that a working man on a working ranch kept because it was useful, not because it was a statement. He showed her how to hold it first, then how to load it, then how to stand. He corrected the position of her elbows twice without impatience, just reached over and adjusted her arms the way you adjust something mechanical, and she noticed that he kept his corrections precise. He did not put his hands anywhere he didn't need to, and he explained what he was adjusting and why. She fired 6 shots at a fence post 30 yards away. She hit it once. "That's better than most people their first time," he said. "Don't patronize me," she said. "I missed 5. He looked at her sideways. "I'm not patronizing you. I'm telling you the truth. Most people pull right when they're nervous. You pulled left, which is less common and usually corrects faster." She looked at the post. "Why left?" "You're watching your hands instead of the target. Your left hand is doing too much work. Loosen it." She reloaded, shot again, hit the post twice in 3. "There," he said. She lowered the rifle and looked at the post. Something had settled in her chest. Not pride exactly, more like the recognition of a capability she hadn't known she had. She was not going to be a marksman after one morning. But she had done it. She had made the thing happen. "Same time next week?" she said. "Same time next week," he agreed. They walked back to the ranch in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. They had gotten past the stage where silences needed to be filled. She had come to understand that Cade Mercer measured words the way a working man measures materials. Use what's needed, waste nothing, and know the difference between what needs saying and what just needs existing. It was, she thought, a quality she was learning to appreciate more than she would have expected. It was around this time that the cattle started disappearing. The first sign was subtle enough that it might have been natural loss. A yearling unaccounted for after a count, a gap in a section of fence that could have been storm damage. Amos noticed it first and mentioned it to Cade with the careful neutrality of someone who doesn't want to raise alarm about something that might be nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. The second disappearance was less subtle. 6 head from the east pasture, gone between a Sunday evening count and a Monday morning one. No storm had passed. The fence was cut, not broken. A clean line through 3 strands of wire with something sharp. The grass around the cut was pressed down in the way that grass gets pressed when several horses have stood in one place for a while. Cade stood at the cut fence with Amos on one side and Pete Dorsey on the other, and Eliza had come out because she had seen them walking that direction with the particular purposefulness that means something has gone wrong. "How many tracks?" Cade asked. Amos crouched, reading the ground with the ease of long practice. 4 horses, maybe 5. They came from the north, swung around the fence line, went back the same way. "They know the property," Pete said. "Or they scouted it," Amos said. "Same thing, near enough." Cade hadn't spoken again. He was looking north, following the direction the tracks pointed, looking at the distance like a man trying to see something that wasn't visible yet. She had learned in the weeks she'd been here that this was what he looked like when he was working through something difficult. Still, quiet, going somewhere inside. "What do we do?" she asked. She didn't ask if there was anything she could do. She'd learned that asking it that way got her nowhere. Direct was better. He looked at her. "We fixed the fence," he said. "We increased the watch rotation." He paused. "And we're careful." It was not a satisfying answer. She could see it wasn't satisfying to him either. "Someone is taking your cattle," she said. "Yes." "That's not a small problem." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She looked at the cut fence and thought about the garden and the root cellar and the kitchen she had put in order, and the bread she baked every few days, and the way Eli had started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, doing his schoolwork while she did the mending. Two people who had arrived at a comfortable parallel without quite deciding to. She thought about all of it and felt something that surprised her in its intensity. She did not want this place taken apart. It was not her home. She was careful with that word, was not yet ready to use it. But it was real to her now, in a way that nothing abstract about it had prepared her for. She had put her hands into it. She had sweated and scrubbed and planted and worked until her back ached. And she had seen what the place was underneath the neglect. And it was good. It was something that deserved to last. "Tell me what to watch for," she said. "If you're going to increase the watch, tell me what I should know." Cade looked at her for a moment, then at Amos. Amos shrugged. "She's got better eyes than Carl," he said, which was probably a compliment to her, and definitely a criticism of Carl, and she filed both away. "All right," Cade said, "let's walk the north line." They were not alone in their trouble. That became clear when Cade came back from town a week later with the particular face of a man who has confirmed something he was hoping not to confirm. He sat at the kitchen table that evening. She had started leaving coffee on for him when he came in late, and he had started expecting it without making a point of it. And he told her what he'd learned. 3 other ranches in the territory had reported losses. Peterson's place to the north, the Callahan spread east of the river, and old Munoz, who ran sheep more than cattle, but had lost a good portion of his flock to what looked like the same organized theft. Not isolated incidents. A pattern. Whoever was doing this was moving systematically through the valley, working in the dark, and had enough horses and enough men to move livestock quietly and quickly across long distances. "There's talk in town," Cade said. "What kind of talk?" "Land talk." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "There's a company, a development company out of Denver, calling themselves Consolidated Western. They've been buying up properties across 3 counties, mostly ranches that have run into trouble." He paused. Several of the places they acquired were having problems with theft before the purchase offer came. She absorbed this. So the theft is deliberate, to devalue the land before the offer. That's one way to read it. Is there another way? He looked at her. Not one that makes more sense. She thought about this. Have they approached you? Not directly. He set down the cup. A man named Delaney came through 2 months before you arrived, said he was a surveyor. I didn't think much of it at the time. He stopped. I probably should have. You couldn't have known, maybe. He didn't sound convinced. She understood that he was not the kind of man who accepted excuses easily, including his own. She had come to understand this about him. The particular standard he held himself to, inflexible in some ways and quietly fair in others, and the way he turned that same unflinching attention on everything he was responsible for. They're not going to get this land, she said. He looked at her. I'm just saying, she said, in case you needed to hear it said. I was quiet for a moment. You've been here 6 weeks, he said. I know how long I've been here. And you're already... He stopped. Already what? He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at the table and then at the window and then at nothing in particular. She watched him decide whether to say the thing he'd started. Invested, he said finally. Yes, she said. I am. Neither of them said anything else. She refilled his cup and went back to the mending she'd been doing at the other end of the table. And he went back to the ledger he'd brought in from the desk, and they sat at the same table for another hour without speaking, and it was not strange. That was the evening she understood something about Cade Mercer that she hadn't quite put into words before. He did not perform his feelings. He didn't announce them or dramatize them or ask to be noticed for having them. He just had them, quietly, and if you were paying attention you could see them. In the way he looked at Eli when the boy wasn't watching. in the way he touched Hannah's garden fence when he passed it, in the way he'd said she'd have been glad of that, I think, and then walked away before he had to look at anyone. She didn't know what to do with that observation. She put it away and went back to the mending. The night the armed men came, Cade was not there. He'd ridden out with Amos and Pete to check the north fence line. They'd been alternating night watch since the theft began, and this was Cade's rotation. Eli was asleep. Carl Dorsey was in the bunkhouse nursing a hand he'd injured on the hay equipment, which meant the bunkhouse was occupied, but not by anyone who was going to be useful in a crisis. Eliza was in the kitchen. She was supposed to be in bed. She had tried to go to bed, but something had kept her awake. She had been sleeping lighter since the thefts began, a habit her body had developed without consulting her. And she'd come down to warm milk, which she despised but which helped. And she was standing at the stove when she heard the horses, too many of them. The sound was wrong, not the familiar rhythm of one or two horses coming in off the range, but a group, moving deliberately, no voices among them. She crossed to the window without lighting a lamp. In the moonlight, she could see 4 riders coming up the access road. They were not hurrying. That was the thing that frightened her most, their lack of hurry, the confidence of men who believed they were not going to be stopped. She thought about waking Carl. Then she thought about Carl's hand and his temperament, and the way he'd handled the last difficult situation, which was badly, and she decided against it. She thought about going to get the rifle. She did get the rifle. She went to the hall where Cade kept it racked, and she took it down and loaded it with hands that were not steady, but were steady enough. And she checked that she'd done it right twice. Then she went to the front door. She stood there for a moment. She thought, you could stay inside. Lock the door. Let them take what they came for and wait for Cade to come back. Then she thought about the garden, about the root cellar and the bread and the mended fence that she could see from the kitchen window, about Eli sleeping upstairs, about everything that had been built here and what it meant for men like these to just ride in and help themselves to it. She opened the door. She stepped out onto the porch. The 4 riders pulled up short when they saw her. Even in the moonlight, she could read their surprise. They'd expected an empty house, or at most a woman who'd shut herself in. Not a woman standing on the porch with a rifle held in a way that suggested she knew which end was which. The man in front was broad and thick-necked, with a hat pulled so low she couldn't see much of his face. He held his horse steady and looked at her for a moment. Evening, he said, like this was a social call. You need to turn around, she said. Her voice was level. She had not known if it would be. We're just passing through, ma'am. No, she said. You're not. He shifted in his saddle. The horse moved and she tracked it automatically, the way Cade had taught her. Don't watch the man. Watch the whole picture. You don't want trouble, the man said. I didn't invite it, she said. Turn around. One of the men behind him said something low that she couldn't hear. The leader looked at her for another moment, assessing. She held still under the assessment. She did not move the rifle, did not shift her weight, did not give him anything to read as uncertainty. The thing about a standoff is that it often comes down to who moves first and what that first movement signals. She understood this without being able to articulate it. She just stood there and was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, and it didn't change anything. Who's inside? He said. Men with guns, she said. This was not strictly accurate since Carl was the only one inside and his hand was wrapped and his gun was in the bunkhouse. But it was not a situation that rewarded accuracy. Another long moment. Then the man turned his horse. Another night, he said, to no one in particular. They rode back down the access road. She watched them until she could not see them anymore. Then she stood on the porch in the Wyoming night with the rifle in her hands and her heart hammering somewhere in the vicinity of her throat, and she waited until she was sure they were gone. Then she sat down on the porch step. Her legs were not entirely steady. She sat there for a while. The night sounds came back. Insects, a horse in the barn, wind through the grass. Normal sounds, the kind that meant nothing was coming. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats from the north, the familiar sound of Cade's horse, and then Amos, and then Pete coming up behind. And she stood and was standing on the porch with the rifle held down at her side when Cade came through the gate. He pulled up when he saw her. He looked at the rifle, at her face, at the dark access road behind her. What happened? He said. She told him. Flatly, without embellishment. 4 riders. What they'd looked like. What she'd said. What they'd done. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he sat on his horse for a moment and looked at the access road and then at her. "You stood them off," he said. "They weren't expecting resistance." "That doesn't diminish what you did." She looked at the rifle in her hands. "I said there were men inside." "Smart." "It was a lie." "It was tactics," he said. Don't apologize for tactics." He swung down from his horse and handed the reins to Pete, who had come in behind him and was looking at Eliza with an expression of frank astonishment. "Go check the outbuildings," Cade said to Amos. "Make sure they didn't get anything while she had their attention at the front." Amos looked at Eliza. It was a quick look, but she caught it. There was something in it she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite admiration, because Amos Birch was not a man who offered admiration cheaply, but something that belonged in the same category. He moved toward the barn. Cade came up onto the porch. He was close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face. They'd been riding since late afternoon. And underneath the exhaustion, something that looked like it was working through several things at once. "You should have woken Carl," he said. "Carl's hand—" "I know about Carl's hand. He could still have stood in a doorway." He paused. "You shouldn't have faced 4 men alone." "There wasn't anyone else." "There's always another option." She looked at him. "What option? Let them take what they came for? That's not an option. That's giving up." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "It's not an option." He reached out and, carefully, the same way he adjusted her elbows during shooting practice, with purpose and no excess, took the rifle from her hands. Checked it. Set it against the porch rail. "Go inside," he said. "I'll send Eli down to stay with you while we do rounds." "I don't need—" "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'm sending him anyway. He'll sleep better if he's near you." He said it without sentimentality, just as a fact about his son. "And I'll sleep better knowing he is." She looked at him. "All right," she said. She went inside. Eli came down 10 minutes later, half asleep, wrapped in a blanket, and sat in the kitchen chair without being asked, and was asleep again in 5 minutes. She sat across from him and watched his face in the lamplight, and thought about what Cade had said. "I'll sleep better knowing he is," and what it meant that a man who measured his words so carefully had said that without appearing to think about it. She put more wood on the stove and sat with the boy until morning came. By the time the sun was up, word had come from the Peterson ranch that they'd had riders too. The same night, earlier in the evening, and they had not been turned away. The Petersons had lost 11 head and a section of fence that would cost 2 weeks of work to repair. The news traveled fast, the way bad news does in a place where everyone depends on everyone else's safety. By midday, Cade had ridden to 2 neighboring ranches, and by evening he and 3 other ranch owners were sitting in the Mercer kitchen. Eliza had made coffee and then stayed because she had decided that this was her business too, and no one had told her otherwise, talking about what was happening and what could be done. The consensus was grim. Whoever was behind the raids knew the territory. They knew when ranches were short-handed and when the watch rotation had gaps. They moved fast and they moved quiet, and they had enough men and horses that they could hit multiple properties in the same night. "Consolidated Western," said a rancher named Tanner, who had a gray beard and the permanently squinted expression of a man who has spent decades looking into Wyoming wind. "My brother-in-law in Cheyenne says they've been operating for 3 years. They go into a territory, drive down the land values, then buy in when people are desperate enough to sell." "They're patient," said another man, younger, whose name Eliza hadn't caught. "And they're organized," Cade said. "That's the harder problem." "We need the marshal," Tanner said. "Marshal Duff is in Laramie until the end of the month," someone said. "Wire him?" "And say what? We have organized theft in a pattern we can't prove yet. He'll come when he can. We can't wait that long." The conversation went around the table several times, the way conversations do when there are no good options and everyone knows it. Eliza listened and said nothing for a while, mapping the shape of the problem. Then she said, "The fence cut on the east pasture. Amos said it was a clean cut, not a break. Which means someone with tools, someone who's been close enough to study the fence." The men at the table looked at her. She continued, "If they're scouting before they raid, they'll be watching for patterns in our response. If all 4 ranches increase night watch at the same time, they'll notice. But if only 2 do and the other 2 appear not to respond—" She stopped. "Is there any way to use that?" Cade was looking at her steadily. Tanner said, "You're talking about bait." "I'm talking about a trap," she said. "If they think the Callahan Ranch or the Munoz place looks undefended, it's dangerous," Tanner said. Everything we're talking about is dangerous, she said. But right now they're choosing when and where. If we can make them choose wrong, Cade said, it's not a bad idea. The table went quiet. Tanner looked at Cade. You trust her read on this? Cade looked at Eliza. She held his gaze. Yes, he said. Simple as that. Just yes. Tanner looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's revising an opinion. All right, he said. Let's think through it. They stayed at the table until nearly midnight working through it. When the ranchers finally left, Eliza cleared the coffee cups and Cade stood in the doorway watching the last horse disappear down the road. You didn't have to stay quiet as long as you did, he said, without turning around. I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I said anything. That's smart. He turned. In the lamplight, the gray at his temples was more pronounced, and she noticed again the lines around his eyes. Not just age, but something else. The kind of lines that come from years of squinting into difficult things. Tanner will come around, she said. Tanner already has, he said. He's just slow to show it. He paused. You did well tonight, both times. She picked up the last cup. I didn't do anything remarkable. You stood on that porch alone with the rifle and turned 4 men around, he said. And then you sat at a table with 4 ranchers who didn't know you and changed the direction of the conversation. He paused again. I'd call that remarkable. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said the thing that existed in that moment, the shape of it, whatever it was, the thing that had been building in the space between 2 people doing hard work side by side in hard circumstances. It was not ready to be said. Probably they both knew that. But it was there, and it had been there a while. And they were both aware of it in the way you're aware of weather changing before the rain actually comes. Good night, Mr. Mercer, she said. Good night, Eliza, he said. She went up the stairs. The Wyoming night was quiet outside her window. The barn was dark. The garden was dark. Somewhere out beyond the fence line, the same men who had come tonight were camped somewhere under the same sky, planning their next move. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She was not afraid. She was something else. Something she did not have a word for. Something that had to do with the sense of being entirely present in a life. Not watching it from a distance. Not waiting for it to become something bearable. She was here. She had made herself be here by force of will and stubbornness and the refusal to be still. And here had turned out to be something she had not expected. She had come to Mercer Ridge with nothing but a ruined dress and a broken engagement and the desperate need of a place to stand. She did not know what she had now. But it was more than that. She closed her eyes. The wind moved through the grass outside. She slept. The trap they set took 11 days to build and 3 hours to fall apart in exactly the wrong way. The plan had been careful. Tanner's ranch and the Munoz property would maintain visible, obvious watch rotations. Lanterns moving at predictable intervals, horses tied where they'd be seen from the road. While Mercer Ridge and the Callahan spread ran dark and quiet, with men positioned in the shadows of outbuildings and tree lines, waiting. The idea was sound. The execution was as good as 4 ranches working in coordination could manage, which was not perfect but was reasonable. What they had not accounted for was the man they were dealing with. Whoever ran the operation had a talent for reading situations, and sometime during those 11 days he read this one. On the night they'd chosen, a moonless Tuesday with good cloud cover, the raiders hit the Tanner property instead of the undefended ones. Not to steal, to destroy. They cut the water lines to the stock tanks, drove a section of the main fence into the road, scattered the remuda into the dark, and were gone before Tanner's men understood they were even there. A message, clear as language. We know what you're doing, we know you're watching, and we don't care. Cade heard about it before dawn and rode to Tanner's before breakfast. Eliza had the coffee on when he came back, and she could read it in the set of his shoulders before he said a word. They knew, he said. Yes. He sat down at the table. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him and sat across with her own. Someone told them, he said. This was the thing neither of them wanted to be true. Because if it was true, then the problem was not just outside the fence. It was inside it, in the complicated network of people who knew the valley and worked it and talked to each other in town and at the mill and over fences on shared property lines. An informant was a different kind of trouble than a raider. Harder to find. Harder to confront. You don't know that, she said. They could have been watching us long enough to figure out the pattern without anyone telling them. That's possible, he said, but it's the optimistic read. Maybe. She wrapped both hands around her cup. What does Tanner say? Tanner says words I won't repeat at this table, Cade said, and she almost smiled despite herself. The weeks that followed were the hardest since she'd arrived. Not because of dramatic events, it was almost the opposite. The raids stopped. The raiders went quiet the way a storm goes quiet between bands, that false stillness that experienced people know not to trust. The valley held its breath. The ranches ran their watches, checked their fences, counted their cattle with a regularity that began to feel less like management and more like anxiety given a task to perform. And in that quiet stretch of waiting, Eliza and Cade fell into a routine that was domestic in its surface and something else entirely underneath. Mornings she ran the house. She had gotten the kitchen into real working order by now, had made progress on the garden, 2 beds producing, a third turned and seeded, and had reorganized the storage and the supply system in ways that saved enough money on waste to make a small difference in the monthly accounting. She knew it made a small difference because Cade had started leaving the ledger on the kitchen table, not asking her to look at it, but not moving it either. And she had started looking at it and occasionally leaving a note in the margin with a question or an observation, and he had started responding to the notes. It was an entire conversation conducted in margins. She was not sure what to make of it. She wasn't sure she needed to make anything of it right now. The shooting practice continued every Thursday. She was getting better in the way that you get better at physical things when you practice with honest attention. Not dramatically, not in leaps, but in the steady accumulation of small corrections that add up to real capability. She could hit a fence post reliably at 50 yards now. She could reload without looking at her hands. She had asked Cade to teach her the revolver as well as the rifle, and she was less accurate with it but more comfortable, the weight of it less alien in her hand than it had once been. One Thursday, he changed the target without telling her. She raised the rifle, found the fence post where she expected it, and it wasn't there. Instead, there were 3 tin cans at varying distances, positioned in no particular order. Left one first, he said, then right, then center. She looked at the arrangement. They're at different distances. Yes. The adjustment between yes, he said. Figure it out. She looked at the cans for a moment. Then she raised the rifle and took the left one, adjusted. She could feel the adjustment now, had internalized it enough that it was in her body rather than in her calculations. And took the right one, and then the center. 3 shots, 2 cans down. She'd pulled on the third and clipped it rather than taking it clean. Again, he said, I need to reset. Next 3, right, center, left. She took a breath, reset her feet. Shot. All 3 this time, not clean on the center but down. Good, he said. Not effusive, just the word, meaning what it said. She lowered the rifle and her arms were shaking slightly. She was out of practice on sustained shooting, the muscles not quite built for it yet. Why the change? Because a fence post stays still, he said, and situations don't. He picked up the cans, reset them at different positions. You need to be able to assess and respond, not just execute a plan you already made. She thought about this. Is this still about shooting? He looked at her sideways. Mostly. She almost smiled. Again, he said. They were still at it an hour later, past the time they usually stopped, because she had decided she was going to hit all 3 cleanly or she was not going to go inside. And Cade had not argued with this logic. When she finally did it, 3 clean shots, 3 clean falls, in the sequence he called and in the time it took her to breathe twice, she felt something release in her chest that had been tight for weeks. She lowered the rifle. There it is, he said quietly. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she had seen before but couldn't quite name, a kind of careful regard, like looking at something valuable without wanting to be obvious about the looking. She turned back before he could see whatever was on her face. Same time next week, she said. Same time, he agreed. It was Eli who told her about Warren Aldgate, and he told her by accident. She was helping the boy with his arithmetic. She had started doing this 2 or 3 evenings a week, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had discovered that Eli was bright in the way that untended to children are bright, meaning fully capable and entirely unaware of it, when he said, without looking up from his worksheet, "There was a man in town asking about you." She stopped. "What man? I don't know him. He was at the post office when I went for the mail. Hendricks was there and I heard him say your name." He erased something on his paper. "Handsome man, I guess. Dark hair. He had a nice horse." Her stomach had done something she did not like. "What did he say?" Just asked if you were still at Mercer Ridge, Zag. Eli looked up. Hendricks told him yes. Was that wrong? She sat with this for a moment. No, she said carefully. Hendricks didn't know any better. Who is he? Someone I used to know. She looked at the arithmetic worksheet. Let's finish this problem. Eli watched her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he had, like his father's, but less restrained, the full curiosity of a boy who hadn't yet learned to hide it. Is it the man who didn't come to the wedding? She looked at him. He did not look away. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment, working on his arithmetic. Then, what does he want? I don't know yet. Are you scared? She considered this honestly. No, she said, I'm not. And she found, as she said it, that it was true. She wasn't scared. She was something cooler and harder than scared, something that had been forming since the morning she'd walked out of that church, built up layer by layer through months of hard work and long nights, and the discovery of a self she had not known she was capable of being. Good, Eli said, and went back to his arithmetic. She told Cade that night. I was at the desk going over the supply order when she came to the doorway of the front room. She had thought about how to say it, and decided that direct was the only way she knew how to say anything anymore. A man was asking about me in town, she said. Warren Aldgate. The man who was supposed to marry me. Cade looked up. Eli told me. She leaned against the doorframe. He's in the area. He set down his pen. What does he want? I don't know. Nothing good. She paused. I want you to know before he shows up, because I think he will show up. He doesn't take being ignored well. Cade looked at her steadily. What kind of man is he? She thought about it. The kind who's used to getting what he wants because he's charming enough that people give it to him before they realize he hasn't earned it. She paused. He's not dangerous. Not physically. He's just... She searched for the word, persistent, and he doesn't understand the word no as a complete sentence. All right, Cade said. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said quickly, because she wanted to be clear about that. I just want you to know. I know, he said. Thank you for telling me. She nodded, turned to go. Eliza. She stopped. Whatever he says when he comes, Cade said, you don't owe him anything. Not an explanation and not your time. You understand that. She looked at him. I know. I just wanted to say it, he said, and he went back to his supply order. She went to bed and lay awake for a while and thought about Warren Aldgate, about who he had been to her, which was a person she had built a future around without examining closely enough whether the foundation was actually there. She thought about the version of herself that had loved him, or believed she did, and she felt not grief for that version but something more like tenderness, the way you feel towards someone younger than you who has made an understandable mistake. She fell asleep before she resolved anything, and woke up to a Thursday with clear skies and the smell of rain coming, and she put it away for another time. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon 3 days later. She was in the garden when she heard the horse on the access road, and she stood up with her hands still dirty and watched him come through the gate. It was exactly as she remembered. Dark hair, a good seat on a good horse, the kind of face that people called handsome and that she had once agreed with. He was dressed well, better than the occasion warranted. He had always dressed better than occasions warranted. She had found it appealing once. He saw her and pulled up. His face arranged itself into the expression she remembered. Warm, slightly rueful, the careful expression of a man who has practiced an apology to an audience and is now delivering it. Eliza, he said. Warren, she said. He swung down from his horse. She did not move toward him. She stayed where she was, at the edge of the garden bed, with the trowel in one hand and dirt on both of them. You look well, he said. I am well. She did not ask how he was. What do you want? He seemed mildly surprised by the directness. She had not been particularly direct with him before. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovering. I wanted to see you. I wanted to explain. You had 4 months of engagement and 11 months of courtship to explain anything that needed explaining, she said. You chose to do it by riding south before midnight. I think that explanation was fairly clear. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I panicked, he said. I know that's not enough. No, she agreed. It's not. He moved a step closer, and she did not step back, but she went still in the way animals go still when something uncertain comes near. He saw it and stopped. I made a mistake, he said. I've spent 4 months knowing it was a mistake. Eliza, I had business gone wrong in Cheyenne. Debts I hadn't told you about. I was ashamed, and I ran. It was wrong. I know it was wrong, he paused. But I'm here now. Yes, she said. You are. Can we not talk properly? You're standing in a garden. I like the garden, she said. Say what you came to say, Warren. He looked at her for a moment. The practiced expression shifted into something more honest and less flattering, frustration, and underneath it something she recognized as entitlement, the specific frustration of a person who is not getting the response they prepared for. I want you to come back, he said. I've sorted the debts. I have prospects in Denver, good ones, a real opportunity with a land company. Which land company? She said. He blinked. What? The land company in Denver. Which one? He seemed thrown by the question. Consolidated Western. The world went a degree colder. She kept her face neutral through considerable effort. How long have you been working with them? About 6 weeks. Eliza, what does that have to do with what's your role? Acquisitions. He said it with the slight lift of a man who likes the sound of the word. I identify properties and make initial contact. It's a good position. The pay is Warren. She said his name quietly, and he stopped. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the smile on his face began to falter at the edges. And she put together in those seconds everything she needed to put together. He had come here to retrieve what he thought of as his. He had come with a position at a company that was systematically dismantling ranches in this valley. He had described his role as acquisitions, initial contact, and he had come to Mercer Ridge. You need to leave, she said. Eliza. Now, Warren. You can't be serious. I came all this way. I know you did. She kept her voice flat and steady. And I'm telling you to get back on your horse and ride away from this property. Today. The warmth left his face in stages, like a curtain being drawn. What was underneath it was less appealing, harder, more petulant, a man who was used to the charm working and was recalibrating to a situation where it hadn't. You've changed, he said, and he meant it as an accusation. Yes, she said. I have. Is it him? The way he said it was ugly. Mercer? You're living in his house. Be careful, she said quietly. I heard you stood off his raiders with a rifle. He said it with a short, dismissive laugh. Playing house on a ranch that's already halfway to failing. Leave, she said. I won't say it again. He looked at her for another moment, and she could see him calculating, whether to push further, whether the situation was recoverable, whether the woman in front of him was the same one he had left at an altar, and she demonstrably was not. She held his gaze without difficulty. He turned and remounted his horse. At the gate he stopped and looked back. This isn't finished, he said. She said nothing. He rode out. She stood in the garden until she could no longer hear the horse, and then she allowed herself one full breath, long and slow and controlled, and then she went inside to find Cade. She found him in the barn with Amos, going over the state of the tack, and she stood in the barn doorway and said, Warren Aldgate works for Consolidated Western. Both men looked at her. She told them everything. The acquisition role. What he'd said about identifying properties and making initial contact. The timeline, 6 weeks, which put him with the company in roughly the same period the raids on the valley had intensified. Amos was the first to speak, and what he said was brief and anatomically specific, and not something she would repeat. He's the scout, Cade said. I think so, or one of them. Cade was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance in the way he did when he was working through something. He came here to see if you'd leave with him, he said slowly. If you left, that's information. The household's destabilized. If you stayed and talked to him, he got to see the property. His jaw tightened. Either way, he was gathering intelligence. Yes. She paused. I told him to leave. What did he say when you told him you knew about Consolidated Western? He didn't know I knew. I asked him about the company before he understood why I was asking. Amos looked at her with the expression she'd been slowly earning from him over months. He's going to report back, he said. I know. So they'll move faster now, Cade said. They'll know we've connected them to the scout. He rubbed a hand along his jaw. We need to get word to the other ranches. And we need to wire Marshal Duff. Not a request this time. A full statement. Names, dates, what we know about the operation. I can write the statement, she said. I'm good at organizing information. Both men looked at her. I used to help my father with his contracts, she said. It was the first time she'd mentioned it, and she said it without apology. I know how to write a clear account of events and evidence. Cade looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Tonight, then. They worked on the statement together at the kitchen table that evening, the two of them going back and forth over the details. What they knew with certainty versus what they could reasonably infer, what the dates meant when laid in sequence, how the pattern of raids connected to the properties Consolidated Western had acquired. Eliza wrote in a clear, direct hand, and Cade supplied facts and occasionally corrected her on a date or a name, and by 10 o'clock they had 4 pages that were as solid as they could make them. It's good, he said, reading it through one last time. It's what we have. She capped the ink. Whether it's enough is a different question. He looked at the statement. It'll get Duff here faster than the request would have. And once he's here, he can investigate what we can't. He paused. Consolidated Western is not small. They have lawyers and money and probably friends in the right places, but they're not invincible. No, she said. They're not. He looked at her. You're not afraid of them. I'm not afraid of Warren Aldgate, she said carefully. The operation behind him is a different thing that I take seriously. He nodded slowly. Smart. The look between them lasted a beat longer than it needed to. She was the one who moved first, reaching for the pen to cap it more securely, a small physical action that broke the moment cleanly. I'll take it to the telegraph office in the morning, she said. I'll ride with you. She looked up. You'll ride with me, she repeated. You confronted the man who left you at an altar and got useful intelligence out of him in a garden conversation, he said. That's not nothing. But if he's still in town and he sees you heading to the telegraph office with a document in your hand, that's a problem. She had not thought of this. She accepted it without arguing. All right. We'll take Amos. She nodded and stood, beginning to collect the papers. He reached for his side of them at the same moment, and their hands were briefly adjacent on the table. Not touching, but close, the warmth of proximity in a way she was not expecting and which moved through her before she could decide not to let it. She gathered the papers and stepped back. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed for a while in the dark without lighting the lamp, and she held still with the feeling, unnamed, honest, inconvenient, and did not try to make it into something it wasn't, or argue herself out of something that was simply real. She had been left by a man who looked the part and was not equal to it. She had landed in a place she had not chosen, with a man who looked like nothing and had turned out to be the most solid thing she had touched in years. She had built something here, in the garden and the kitchen and the margins of a ledger and on a fence line with a rifle in her hands. And it was threaded through with something she had not planned for and was not entirely sure she trusted yet. The frontier remained wild. Warren Aldgate was somewhere in town tonight, and he was connected to people who were trying to take this land. And Cade Mercer had said, We'll take Amos with the ease of a man who did not question whether she was part of the we. She lay down in the dark and listened to the Wyoming night and let the feeling exist without doing anything about it. Sleep was a long time coming. The morning ride to town was quiet and watchful. Amos rode slightly behind and to the right, which she recognized after a while as a tactical position, covering the angle she couldn't see from the front. Cade rode beside her. The access road was dry, the sky the particular flat white of a day that couldn't decide whether to be hot or to storm. They sent the wire at 9 in the morning. They were back on the road out of town by 9:30. Halfway back, on the stretch where the road curved west through the scrubland, Amos pulled up short. Both she and Cade stopped. Amos was looking at something off the road, a disturbance in the grass, tracks cutting perpendicular to the road in a direction that didn't match any natural route through the scrubland. How many? Cade said. At least 6 horses, Amos said. Recent, last couple hours. Cade looked at the direction the tracks led, back toward Mercer Ridge. He looked at Eliza. His face had done something, gone very still, very focused, the way it did when the situation had changed, and his mind was already 3 steps ahead. We go fast, he said. Stay between us. She did not argue. They rode hard. When they came over the last rise before the ranch, the property looked quiet. The barn, the outbuildings, the house with its covered porch all sitting in the flat white morning light as they always did. Nothing visibly wrong, but Eli was supposed to be at the house. And there was no smoke from the kitchen chimney. She hadn't lit the stove before she left, which meant Eli would have done it by now if he was there, and the morning was running normally. She had not thought about the chimney on the way out. She thought about it now with a cold precision that was worse than panic. Cade had seen it too. She knew because he looked at the chimney and his hands tightened on the reins in a way she had never seen before. "Eli," he said, low and hard. "Go," she said. They went. The yard was empty when they came through the gate. No horses tied, no men visible, nothing disturbed in any obvious way. The silence was the wrong kind. Amos peeled off toward the barn without being told. Cade was off his horse before it fully stopped, moving toward the house with his hand on his revolver. Eliza dismounted and followed. The front door was open. Cade went in first, and she was half a step behind, and the sight that met them in the main room was one she felt in her chest before she fully processed it. Eli, sitting in the chair by the desk, white-faced and furious and unharmed, his hands gripping the armrests, and standing across the room with the casual arrangement of men who have made themselves at home in someone else's space. 3 men she did not recognize, and 1 she did. Warren Aldgate looked at her with an expression that was no longer charming and had stopped trying to be. "I said it wasn't finished," he said. Cade had gone still in the doorway in the particular way of a man who is doing the rapid calculation of a bad situation. 3 men, 1 armed visibly, 1 he couldn't read, the 3rd near the window. His revolver was in his hand, and the arithmetic was not simple. Eliza did not look at Warren. She looked at Eli. Eli looked back at her. He was scared. She could see it clearly, the tight jaw and the 2 wide eyes. But he was holding it. He was holding it the way his father held things, going somewhere quiet inside himself and waiting. "Let the boy go," she said. "Nobody's holding the boy," Warren said. "We came to have a conversation." "With a 14-year-old boy in an empty house," Cade said. His voice was flat and without any particular quality except certainty. "Get away from him." The armed man, broad, thick-necked, she recognized him dimly as the one who had led the riders the night she'd stood them off the porch, moved his hand toward his holster. Cade's gun came up. "Don't," Cade said. The word was quiet. It carried the complete weight of a man who had done difficult things and was willing to do more of them. The armed man stopped. Warren looked at Cade and then at Eliza, and the calculation was visible on his face, the reassessment of a situation that had not played out the way he'd modeled it. "Eliza," he said, "be reasonable. You can't hold this ranch against what's coming. Consolidated Western has the financing and the connections and the land commissioners in their pocket. What Mercer has here is already half lost. You're a smart woman, you know that." "What I know," she said, "is that you broke into a man's home and put hands on his son. We didn't. You were here when we weren't, and the boy was alone. That's what you did." She looked at him steadily. "You've made this into something you can't walk back from, Warren. Whatever you thought you were doing, you've made it into a crime." The word landed. She watched him recalculate. "Eli," Cade said, "come here." Eli stood up from the chair, walked across the room to where Cade stood. He did it without running, without looking at the men around him, chin level. She felt something move through her that had no precise name. Cade put a hand on the boy's shoulder briefly, one firm touch. And then Eli was behind him, and Cade was fully in the doorway again with his gun up and his eyes on the 3 men. "You have about 30 seconds, Cade said, "to decide whether you're walking out of my house or being carried out." The thick-necked man looked at Warren. Warren looked at Eliza. She offered him nothing. Whatever Warren Aldgate had thought he was going to accomplish by coming here, leverage, intelligence, the chance to retrieve something he believed was his, it had not worked out. She could see him understanding this, the specific understanding of a man who has played a hand badly and has run out of moves. He straightened his jacket. "This isn't over," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It doesn't get more true." The 3 men moved toward the door. Cade stepped aside enough to let them pass, not backing up, just creating room, keeping his gun where it needed to be. She watched each of them go through the door, watching hands and posture the way she'd been taught. The last sound was hoofbeats fading north, then silence. Cade let the breath out slowly and lowered his gun and turned to look at his son. "You all right?" he said. "Yes, sir." Eli paused. "They came about an hour after you left. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited." "You did right," Cade said. "I didn't do anything." "Sometimes waiting is the right thing," Cade said. "Sometimes the bravest thing is to sit still and not make it worse." He paused. "You held. That matters." Eli looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in the boy's face. the fear easing, replaced by something more settled. Then he looked at Eliza. Is that the man from the wedding? He asked. Yes, she said. He's not what I pictured, Eli said. What did you picture? I don't know. More. He shrugged with the honest assessment of a boy his age. He seemed scared of you. She almost laughed. Go get some water, Cade said, and stay inside until I've talked to Amos. Eli went. Cade and Eliza were left in the main room with the door open to the empty yard and the flat white Wyoming sky beyond. She could hear Amos's boots in the barn. Somewhere above, a hawk was riding a thermal in long, slow circles that she could see through the window. He's not going to stop, Cade said quietly. No. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The distance between them in the room was perhaps 6 feet, but something in the air had changed, had been changing for a long time, if she was being honest with herself, and was now closer to the surface than it had ever been. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. He took a moment. Not dramatic, just a man choosing his words with care. Are you going to stay? The question was simple, and it was not simple at all. She thought about Mill Haven, about her mother's house and Mrs. Calloway, and the post office, and every version of her life that had existed before this one. She thought about the wedding dress folded on the shelf of her room upstairs, where she had not moved it in months. She thought about the garden, and the ledger, and the list she had made on the first day and completed, mostly, and added to when she ran out of things on it. She thought about Eli in the kitchen doing arithmetic, about Amos nodding, the first time she'd earned it, about Thursday mornings and tin cans falling and Cade's voice saying, there it is, in a way that was not about shooting. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. He nodded once. Neither of them moved. Outside, the hawk circled lower on the thermal and then caught something and rose again, climbing fast, until it was just a dark point against the white sky. Inside, two people stood in the complicated silence of what had not yet been said and would need to be, and the weight of everything bearing down from the outside, and the particular quality of a moment that would matter later. That both of them already understood would matter, even now, before anything else had happened. Eliza was the one who moved first. I'll start the stove, she said. She went to the kitchen. She built the fire and put the kettle on and stood at the window watching the yard, and she heard Cade's boots cross the main room and go out the front door toward the barn, and she put her hands flat on the kitchen counter and steadied herself against what was coming. Because it was coming. She could feel it the way you can feel Wyoming weather. Not seeing it yet, but the pressure already changing, the air already carrying something new and not yet named. The ranch was quiet in the white afternoon. Not peaceful. Waiting. Marshall Duff arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after the wire. I was a compact man in his 50s with a gray mustache that he kept trimmed and eyes that moved constantly without appearing to, the particular habit of someone who has spent a career reading rooms. He rode in with a deputy and a leather satchel full of documents, and he sat at the Mercer kitchen table for 3 hours going through what Eliza had written and asking questions in the precise, unhurried way of a man who already knows most of the answers and is verifying the ones he doesn't. She answered everything he asked. Cade answered his questions. Amos, brought in for the parts he'd witnessed directly, answered with the characteristic economy of a man who says exactly what he saw and stops there. The deputy wrote it all down in a notebook with the focused concentration of someone who understood that the notes mattered. When they were done, Duff closed the satchel and looked at Cade. Consolidated Western, he said. I've had them under my eye for 2 years. This is the first time I've had enough in one place to move on. He paused. The scout, Aldgate. You said he came to the house. He did, Cade said, with 3 men. One of them was the leader of the raiding party that hit my ranch in August. You're sure of the identification? I am, Eliza said. I stood across from that man on the porch for 4 minutes in moonlight at close range. I am certain. Duff looked at her for a moment. You're the one who turned them off the porch. Yes. He nodded slowly, the way experienced men nod at things that have adjusted their expectations. All right. He stood. I'll need another 2 weeks to get the warrants properly drawn and have enough men in position to do this without losing them in the territory. Can you hold that long? We'll hold, Cade said. In the meantime, don't do anything that gives them cause to claim self-defense and muddy the legal situation. He put on his hat. And don't let Aldgate leave the territory if you can help it. If he runs, we lose the connection between the operation and the company. he rode out that afternoon. 2 weeks, Eliza thought, watching the road after him. She put the thought away and went back to the kitchen. The first week passed in a tight, watchful quiet. The ranch ran its rotations. The neighbors communicated in the careful coded way that people develop in difficult circumstances. A rider passing with a particular pattern of stops meant all was well. A different pattern meant trouble. Eliza had mapped the system in her head and could read it by the second day. She found herself sleeping lighter than ever. Not badly. She had learned to take what sleep came and not argue with what didn't. But close to the surface, the way animals sleep in uncertain seasons. On the 8th day, something else happened that she had not anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every surface detail. She was making bread and Cade was at the desk doing the weekly accounts, and Eli was outside doing the feeding chores. And without any particular lead-up, Cade said from the desk, "I want to tell you something." She looked up from the dough. He had turned in his chair to face her, which was unusual. He generally talked to her while doing something else. Both of them in motion, conversation happening alongside work. This was different. He was sitting still and looking at her with the deliberate quality of a man who has decided to say something he's been holding for a while. "All right," she said. "When you came here," he said, "I told you I needed a partner, that you needed a place to stand." He paused. That was true, but it wasn't all of it. She set the dough down, waited. "Hannah died 2 years and 4 months ago," he said. "I spent about a year after that just running the ranch, working, keeping Eli fed and in school and trying to make sure the whole thing didn't collapse. I wasn't grieving exactly. I was just moving fast enough not to." He stopped. "Then you came." She did not say anything. "You fixed the root cellar," he said, and something in the way he said it was almost funny and almost wasn't. "You fixed everything you could reach, and then you started fixing things I hadn't noticed were broken. And I watched you do it, and I thought, this is a person who doesn't quit, who looks at a hard thing and just—" He made a small gesture that encompassed something he apparently couldn't fit into words. "Goes at it." She swallowed. "I'm not saying this well," he said. "You're saying it fine," she said quietly. He looked at her directly. "I don't know what this is," he said. "Whatever it's been building into, between you and me. I'm not going to put a name on it that you're not ready for. But I wanted you to know that I see it, and I don't want to pretend it's not there." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside she could hear Eli in the yard, talking to the horses the way he always did, a continuous low commentary that neither the horses nor anyone else was required to respond to. She wiped her hands on her apron. She took a breath. "I came here in a wedding dress," she said. "I had been left at an altar 6 hours before I met you. I was in no condition to trust my own judgment about anything." "I know. And I spent the first month convincing myself that whatever I was feeling was just gratitude, displacement, my own loneliness taking a shape that was convenient." She paused. "I spent the second month knowing it wasn't that." He held her gaze. "I'm still afraid of it," she said honestly. "Not of you. Of being wrong again. Of wanting something and not seeing it clearly." She paused. "I'm working on that." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Whatever this is, I told you I was staying and I meant it." He nodded. Something in his face had eased, not opened dramatically, not gone soft in any way that would have been unlike him, but eased. The way a landscape looks when cloud cover shifts and light gets in. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He turned back to his accounts. She went back to the dough. The kitchen resumed its ordinary sounds. The fire in the stove, the dough working, the pen scratching at paper. Normal sounds. The same sounds as any other Tuesday morning, except that the air between them had changed in some quality she couldn't precisely name and didn't need to. She was rolling the dough out when he said, without looking up, "The bread yesterday was better than anything we had before you came." She kept rolling. "That's a low bar." Still true. She did not respond to this, but she was looking at the table when she said it, and she was fairly sure the corner of her mouth had done something. The storm came out of the northwest on the 13th night. She had watched the weather building all afternoon, the particular way Wyoming clouds mass and move, the pressure change that she could feel now in her sinuses and in the way the horses were behaving. By evening, the sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise and the wind had shifted, coming in cold and carrying the smell of rain and something electric. Cade looked at it at sunset from the porch. Tonight, he said. Not a question. I think so, she said. I was quiet for a moment. If they're going to move before Duff gets the warrants, tonight's the kind of night they'd choose, she said. Dark, noisy, hard to hear horses. He looked at her sideways. You've gotten good at thinking like them. You learn what you need to learn, she said. He called everyone together at 7. Amos and Pete and Carl, whose hand had healed enough to be useful, and Eli, who was told in no uncertain terms that he was to stay in the house, and that this was not a suggestion. You're staying inside, Cade told his son. I know, Eli said. And if someone comes to the house, I know what to do, Eli said. He looked at his father with the particular look of a 14-year-old who understands more than he's been told. I know, Dad. Cade looked at him for a moment and then nodded. He put his hand briefly on the back of Eli's neck, and the boy stood very still under it. Eliza said, Eli, there's a loaded rifle in the hall. Eli looked at her. You've seen me shoot, she said. You know how. You don't use it unless you have to, but if you have to... She stopped. You know how. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. Cade looked at her. She met his look. There was no point pretending the possibility didn't exist. If riders came to the house tonight with the men all positioned outside, Eli was alone in the building, and a scared boy with a rifle was better than a scared boy without one. They both knew this. She had simply said it out loud. Everyone take your positions, Cade said. They went out into the early dark. Eliza's position was the house. This had not been fully specified. The plan had been built around the ranch hands and Cade covering the barn, the outbuildings, the gate. But she had been thinking about the geometry of it since yesterday, running the angles in her head the way Cade had taught her to run angles when shooting. See the whole picture, not just the target in front of you. And the picture had a gap in it. The west side of the house, between the stone chimney and the corner of the porch railing, was a blind spot from every position the men were covering. She had not told Cade this. She had a reason. The reason was that he would not have liked the conclusion she'd drawn from it. She put Eli in the kitchen with the door barred and the rifle within reach, and a single lamp burning low, so he was not in the dark, and she took the revolver, her revolver now, in practice if not in ownership, the one she'd worked with twice a week for 3 months. And she went to the second floor. The second floor window on the west side of the house looked directly down the blind angle. She opened it without lighting any lamp. She knelt at the window and looked out into the building dark and the rising wind and waited. The storm came in hard. By 9 o'clock the rain was driving sideways in sheets, and the lightning was near enough that the thunder overlapped it, the crack and the boom nearly simultaneous, the whole sky periodic and violent. She could see almost nothing between the lightning flashes, and then in those flashes she could see everything, the yard, the fence, the shapes of the outbuildings, the darkness beyond the gate. She heard the gunshot at 9:30, one shot, from the direction of the barn, not the random crack of something accidental, but the deliberate report of someone firing with intent. Then shouting, indistinct in the wind and rain, and then more shots from 2 directions at once. They were here. She pressed closer to the window and looked down the west angle. Nothing. Rain, dark, then lightning. In that half-second of white light she saw them, 3 men, moving along the base of the house wall on the west side, low and fast, using the wall for cover from the ranch hands who were positioned to the east. They had planned this, planned the blind spot, planned the angle, planned to come in under the noise of the gunfight while Cade and his men were occupied. They were 20 feet from the corner that led to the back door. She pulled back from the window and moved. She was on the stairs in 3 steps, down them in 4 more, through the kitchen. Eli looked up from his corner, white-faced, and she shook her head at him, meaning stay, and to the back door. She put her back against the wall beside it. She could hear the shots outside still, the distant shouts of men in a fight, rain hammering the roof so hard it drowned the more distant sounds. She could hear footsteps on the west side of the house, careful even through the rain, 3 sets of them. She was not thinking in complete thoughts. She was operating in the stripped-down register of a person whose training has finally got past their fear. Not because the fear was gone, it was still there. She could feel it in her hands, and in the too fast beat of her pulse, but it had been put somewhere that was not in the way. She waited until the sounds were at the corner of the house. Then she opened the back door. The leader came around the corner first, and the door opening 3 feet from him. The unexpected element, the thing he had not planned for, stopped him for the 1 second that she needed. She leveled the revolver at the center of his chest. "Stop," she said. The rain was so loud she wasn't sure he could hear her, but he could see the gun. He stopped. The two men behind him ran into him, and for a moment they were tangled, which was also not what they'd planned. "Guns on the ground," she said louder. The leader looked at her. He was the thick-necked man from the porch, the one who'd ridden away that first night, the one who'd been in the house when Warren came. She recognized him even in the dark and rain. She did not know if he recognized her. It probably didn't matter. He did not put his gun on the ground. "Lady," he said, "you have one gun, and there are 3 of us." "I have one gun pointed at your chest," she said. "How much do you think those odds help the other 2 if I shoot?" The math was not complicated. She watched him do it. One of the men behind him said, "Crane, just—" "Shut up," Crane said. Another shot from the direction of the barn. Closer now. Someone shouted Amos's name. The storm pressed down on everything, flattening sound, making the world smaller and louder and more violent than it had any business being. Crane moved. Not toward her, sideways, using the second of distraction, going for the angle. She tracked him, and the revolver tracked with her, and she fired once. The shot went wide, she pulled it, knew she pulled it in the moment, the angle wrong, and he was already past her reach, inside the arm's length, where the gun was no longer useful in the same way, and his hand came up and hit her arm. She did not drop the gun. She did not drop the gun because she had spent 3 months building the grip in her hands. Not dramatically, not consciously, just repetition until holding was automatic. And the hit broke her arm out and up, but the fingers held. She brought the gun back down. He grabbed for her wrist with both hands, and she let him take the wrist, and she turned with it instead of against it. She did not know where she had learned this, probably nowhere, probably instinct. And the turn brought her into a position where she could drive the heel of her free hand up and into his chin with enough force to click his teeth together hard. He stumbled back. The 2 men behind were moving, and she turned to face them, and in that moment the back door opened and Eli was there, not with the rifle. He'd left it inside. She would understand later that he'd deliberately left it so nobody could take it from him, but with the iron poker from the kitchen fireplace, and he swung it at the nearer of the 2 men with all the ungraceful force of a frightened 14-year-old boy who has decided that waiting is finished. The man went down. Not unconscious, but down, on one knee, and the other one pulled back from a swinging iron poker in the hands of someone who looked like they were absolutely willing to use it again. Crane was getting up. She shot him in the shoulder, not the chest, not where she'd aimed. She had aimed somewhere more decisive and pulled it again, and afterward she would not know if the pull was accident or choice. But the shoulder sat him back down hard, and the gun dropped from his hand, and she kicked it away without looking at it and kept the revolver on him. The 2 men behind her looked at their leader on the ground, and at the gun, and at the boy with the poker, and ran. She did not shoot at them. She let them go into the rain and dark because there were only so many things she could hold at once, and Crane on the ground in front of her was the one that mattered. "Stay down," she said to him. He stayed down. He was holding his shoulder and cursing, and the rain was soaking him, and the mud was getting into everything, and he stayed down. The back door behind her opened wider, and Eli came out fully, still holding the poker, shaking hard. She could feel it even without touching him, that particular full-body shaking that comes after something frightening, when the body finally has a second to acknowledge it. "You're all right," she said, not looking away from Crane. "Yeah," Eli said. "Go back inside." "Are you—" "Go inside, Eli. Take the rifle off the wall and sit with it. I'll be there in a minute." He went inside. She stood in the rain with the revolver on Crane and listened to the sounds of the fight at the barn, which were changing. She could hear that they were changing. Less chaotic, more deliberate. The sound of a thing that is reaching its conclusion. She was soaked through. Her hair was plastered flat. The rain drove against her face, and she stood with her eyes open in it and waited. She heard Cade's voice first. She could not hear the words over the rain and wind, but she knew the voice, knew it well enough by now that she could distinguish it from 30 yards in a storm. And then she heard him call her name. "Here," she said, not shouting. She wasn't sure she could. He came around the corner of the house with Amos 2 steps behind, both of them rain-soaked and carrying rifles, and he saw her standing over Crane with the revolver, and he stopped. He looked at Crane, at the blood on Crane's shoulder, at her. "Eliza," he said. "He's alive." "Alive," she said. "I shot wide." "You shot wide on purpose." She thought about this. "I don't know." He crossed to her in 4 steps and took the revolver out of her hand, and she let him. Because her hands were finally shaking and she did not want him to see that, and he probably saw it anyway, but he didn't say anything. He handed the gun to Amos. How many came this way? 3. Crane and 2 others. The other 2 ran. We have 4 at the barn, he said. Dorsey and Carl are holding them. One of them is going to need a doctor. He looked at her. Are you hurt? No. He looked at her hands, at her arm where Crane had grabbed it. He hit my arm, she said. I'm fine. He did not respond to this. He reached out, and she was not entirely expecting it, his hand on the side of her face, brief and certain, like a man making sure something real is where he thought it was. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then he turned to Amos. Tie Crane up and get him inside out of the rain. He's no good to Duff dead. Yes, sir, Amos said. Eli, she said. He's inside. He used the fireplace poker on one of them. Cade turned to look at her. He's not hurt, she said, but he needs you. He went to the back door. She heard him call his son's name in a different voice than the one he used in the yard. And she heard Eli's voice answer. And then she could not hear the rest of it because the storm was still loud, and she was grateful for that. Some things were not for outside ears. She walked around to the front porch and sat on the steps. She put her hands on her knees and looked out at the dark, rain-hammered yard. The lightning was moving east now, the storm past its worst, the thunder rolling more distant with each interval. She was soaked and cold, and her arm ached where it had been grabbed, and she was the most awake she had ever been in her life. Pete Dorsey came from the direction of the barn. Half an hour later, drenched, with a cut above his eyebrow that he didn't seem to have noticed. We've got them all tied, he said. Carl took a hit, his leg. It's not good, but it's not going to kill him. Doc Hennessy. Send someone to town at first light, she said. Don't send anyone in the dark on those roads. Yes, ma'am. He looked at her. You all right? Fine. He nodded and went to the barn. She sat on the porch steps, and the rain came down lighter now, from driving sheets to something steady and ordinary. And she sat in it and breathed and let everything settle through her, the way things settle after violence. Not clean, not resolved, but present. The way you are more present for a while after something has happened that could have gone the other way. Cade came out eventually. He had a blanket. She didn't know where he'd gotten it or why he'd thought of it, but he had one, and he put it around her shoulders without asking and sat down on the step beside her, not touching, just there. There. Eli's asleep, he said. He crashed the moment I got him settled, the way kids do. Good, she said. She meant it. A long silence. You figured out the blind spot, he said. Yes. You didn't tell me. You would have put someone else there. I was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I would have. It needed to be me, she said. I understood the angle, and I could get back to Eli faster than any of the hands if something went wrong. He didn't agree with this reasoning, and she knew it, and neither of them said so. You shot him in the shoulder, he said. I shot wide. You said you don't know if it was on purpose. I don't. She paused. Does it matter? He thought about it. No, he said. I suppose not. The result is what it is. The rain came down soft now, barely more than a heavy mist, and the air smelled the way Wyoming air smells after a storm, washed clean, full of something green and cold. She had come to love that smell. She hadn't known she would, coming from a town where rain just made the streets muddy and the people irritable. But here it meant something different. It meant the land was still alive. Warren was behind the attack tonight, she said. He'd have known Duff was coming, someone in the legal network, someone connected to Consolidated Western. That's why they moved before the 2 weeks were up. I know, Cade said. We'll give everything we have to Duff when he arrives. Crane will talk when he understands what his other option is. He'll try to run, she said. Warren, when he hears this didn't work. Duff's deputy is watching the South Road, Cade said. I sent word tonight before the attack. He paused. I was expecting something before the deadline. She looked at him. You were expecting this. I thought it was possible. You didn't tell me. He looked at her, mirroring her from earlier. You would have done something, she said. Yes. He almost smiled. It was the shadow of a smile, just the corner of it. Yes, he said. You would have. She pulled the blanket tighter. The night was going gray at the horizon. Not dawn yet, but the direction of it. the sky beginning to differentiate between dark and darker. "Cade," she said. I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without making it into less than it is." He looked at her. He didn't say anything, which was the right response. "I have been afraid," she said, "for months, of the way I feel about this place and about—" She paused, made herself continue. "About you. Because the last time I arranged my life around a person, I did not look clearly at the foundation before I built on it, and I promised myself I would not do that again." He was listening. She could feel him listening in the complete, undivided way he had. "I have been looking clearly," she said, "since the first week. That's what I've been doing while I was fixed the root cellar and learned to shoot and wrote that statement for Duff, and stood on this porch in the dark with armed men in the yard. I have been looking at you clearly, at what you are and what you're not, at what this place is." She paused. "You are not easy. You are not uncomplicated. You have grief you haven't finished with, and you are better at managing a ranch than managing what's inside you, and you ask less of people than you should, and more of yourself than is reasonable." He said nothing. "And you are the most honest person I have met in my life," she said, "and I trust your word completely. And those two things are worth more to me than anything I thought I wanted before." The gray at the horizon was spreading. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on her knee. He did not make a speech about it. He just took it, held it, his hand over hers, neither of them looking at the other, but both aware of every point of contact with the precision of people who have been careful for a long time. "I'm not Warren Aldgate," he said finally. "I know. I don't run," he said, "whatever happens. I don't run from hard things, and I don't run from people." "I know," she said, "and I'd like—" He stopped. "Say it," she said quietly. "I'd like to stop pretending I don't come inside for the coffee because it means another 20 minutes in the same room with you," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. In the gray pre-dawn light, soaked through, blanket around her shoulders, hands shaking slightly still from aftermath, she laughed. Not a polite laugh or a social laugh, but the real kind, the unexpected kind. The kind that comes when something is simultaneously funny and true and precisely right. And it happened before she could decide whether to. He watched her laugh, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that on another man's face would have been a full smile. She stopped laughing. She looked at their hands. "All right," she said. "Then stop pretending." He didn't answer with words. He turned her hand over and held it, palm up, and she felt the roughness of his thumb against the inside of her wrist and the warmth of it. And they sat like that on the porch steps in the thinning dark, while the Wyoming dawn came up over the hills and painted the washed air in colors she didn't have names for. Marshal Duff arrived at mid-morning with 4 deputies and 2 wagons. He looked at the state of the yard, the torn-up mud, the section of fence that had been pulled, the barn door off one hinge, the 9 tied men sitting in the rain shelter of the outhouse overhang, with Amos watching them with a rifle and an expression of profound disinterest. And he said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Cade. "You said wait 2 weeks," Cade said. "I did," Duff agreed. "They didn't." "No," Duff said. "They didn't." He looked at the prisoners again. "Is Crane among them?" "Shoulder wound," Amos said. "In the house." Duff looked at Eliza. "You're doing?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her for the same recalibrating moment that people had been giving her since she'd arrived at Mercer Ridge, the moment of adjusting a first impression to match a current reality. "Right," he said. "Let's get started." The questioning took most of the day. Crane talked within the first hour, which was faster than any of them had expected, and what he said was extensive and specific and damaging to enough people at Consolidated Western that Duff sent a second wire before noon. By afternoon, 2 of the other men had added to it. The picture that emerged was larger and uglier than even the 4 ranches had understood. A systematic operation across 5 counties, a network of local informants, a land commissioner in Cheyenne who had been taking payments to expedite acquisition paperwork, and Warren Aldgate, who had been stopped at the southern road by Duff's deputy that morning at dawn, trying to reach the Cheyenne rail connection with a saddlebag containing documents that he had apparently not had time to burn. Duff brought him to the ranch at 2 in the afternoon. Eliza was in the yard when the deputy rode in with Warren on a second horse, his hands tied to the saddle horn, his good clothes ruined by a night apparently spent in the same storm. He looked at her when he came through the gate, and she looked at him. He said, Eliza, you have to understand, I had no choice. The company, the debts, if I didn't deliver. Warren, she said. He stopped. She said it simply and without anger, which was perhaps the thing he least expected. The anger would have given him something to push against, to argue with, to perform remorse in response to. The absence of it left him with nothing. You always had a choice, she said. You have made the choices you've made for as long as I've known you. They were always your choices. She paused. That's all. She turned away. She heard the deputy lead his horse toward the others. She heard Warren say something that might have been her name again, and she did not turn back. Cade was standing near the barn. He had seen the exchange. He met her eyes across the yard, and she walked toward him, and he waited for her in the plain, ordinary way of a man who knows the person walking toward him is going to get there. She stopped beside him. Over? He said. She thought about it. The legal process was not over. There would be statements and hearings, and the unwinding of Consolidated Western's interests across the territory, and that would take time. The marshal would come and go. The paperwork would pile up and get sorted and pile up again the way it did. But the thing he was asking about was over. She knew what he was asking. Yes, she said, that part's over. He nodded once. Looked at the yard, at Duff directing his deputies, at Amos managing the prisoner situation with his characteristic grim competence, at Pete Dorsey hammering the barn door back onto its hinge with more enthusiasm than skill, at the mountains in the distance going gold in the afternoon light. Lot of work to do, he said. Yes, she said. There is. Fence needs replacing on the west side. And the barn door. And the barn door, he agreed. She looked at the yard. At all of it. At the work still ahead and the work already done and the shape of this life that had come out of a morning she thought was the end of everything. She put her hands in her apron pockets. Well, she said, we'd better start. The fence on the west side took 4 days to replace properly. Cade and Pete and Amos worked it in sections, pulling the ruined posts and setting new ones, stretching fresh wire in the cold October air that had moved in behind the storm. Eliza brought coffee out twice a day and did not make a point of it, and the men accepted it without making a point of it either, and that was the arrangement. She had other things to manage. Carl was laid up with his leg wound for 3 weeks, which meant the household absorbed extra work, and she absorbed it the way she absorbed most things now, by adding it to the list and working through it. Doc Hennessy came from Millhaven and said Carl would walk fine eventually if he rested, which Carl did not want to do, and which Eliza enforced with a firmness that surprised Carl and did not surprise anyone else. You're worse than a field sergeant, Carl told her from his bunk on the second day. You can walk on that leg in 3 weeks or limp on it for 3 years, she said. Pick. Carl picked rest. Marshal Duff came back twice in the following month, once to take depositions, once to bring news of the proceedings in Cheyenne. The land commissioner, who had been taking payments from Consolidated Western, had been removed from his position and was facing charges. The company's principals in Denver had hired expensive lawyers, which Duff said with the flat resignation of a man who had seen this before, but the evidence was substantial enough that the lawyers were managing a reduction in consequences rather than an escape from them. The properties that had been acquired under duress were under review. It would take time. Legal things always took time. And Warren Aldgate, Cade said, at the kitchen table during Duff's second visit, cooperated fully once he understood the alternative, Duff said. He said it without satisfaction. Just a fact. He'll serve time. Not as much as Crane, but time. He paused. He asked me to tell you, Miss Rowan, that he was sorry. She was at the stove. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her face was neutral. Thank him for the sentiment, she said, and tell him I don't need it. Duff looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and moved on. When he left that afternoon, he shook Cade's hand and then, without making ceremony of it, he shook hers. You people held this together when a lot of others wouldn't have, he said. The territory's better for it. She thanked him. He rode out. She watched him go and then went back inside to finish the supper she'd been working on. That evening, after Eli was in bed, she and Cade sat at the kitchen table in the comfortable way they had developed. The way two people sit together when they've stopped performing ease and are actually easy. She was mending a shirt. He had the ledger. The lamp between them threw a warm circle. They both sat inside. Tanner came by while you were with Duff, he said. I saw his horse. I wants to put together a ranch association, a formal one, shared watch protocols. communal fence maintenance on the boundary lines, a collective account for emergencies. He looked at the ledger. He asked if we'd be part of it. What did you tell him? I said I'd think about it. He paused. I think it's a good idea. So do I. He wrote something in the ledger. He also said, he stopped. She looked up. He said the other ranches wanted to acknowledge what you did, in the yard and at the house during the attack. He said it carefully, in the way he said things that were important to him but that he was not sure how to frame. He called it exceptional. She went back to the mending. I did what needed doing. That's what exceptional usually looks like, he said. She kept her eyes on the shirt. Is that your opinion or Tanner's? Both, he said. She kept mending and did not respond to this, and he kept writing in the ledger and did not press it, and the lamp burned warm between them, and the Wyoming night was quiet outside the window. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of thing that would be noted in any ledger or remembered in any formal way. But she thought about it later, thought about the specific quality of it. Two people at a table in the light, ordinary and settled, the whole difficult weight of the past months outside the door, and not yet finished but held back for now. And she understood that this was the thing she had not known she was looking for. Not romance in the way she had once imagined it. Not the version of happiness that announces itself with music and good weather. Just this. Someone at the same table. The warmth of a lamp. Work that meant something. She had been wrong about a lot of things in her life. She had misjudged a man she'd intended to marry. She had arrived at Mercer Ridge in a ruined dress with nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to sit down. She had spent months being afraid of the very thing she needed most. She had also learned in those months that being wrong was not the end of anything, that the correction was available if you were willing to look clearly and move toward what was true instead of away from what was frightening. She thought this was probably the most useful thing she had ever learned. 2 weeks later, she wrote to her mother. Not the short, careful letter she had sent at the beginning, the one that said only, I am safe, I am working, do not worry. This one was longer. She told her mother where she was and what she had been doing and what the ranch looked like in the fall. And she told her about Eli and about Amos and about the garden that was going dormant now but had produced enough in its partial first season to make her believe in the next one. She told her mother about Cade without making more of it than she knew how to put in a letter. And her mother, who was a woman of considerable intelligence and no patience for euphemism, would read between those careful lines and understand exactly what was there. She did not tell her about the night of the storm. That would come later, in person, when she could look at her mother's face and reassure her with more than words. She asked her mother to visit in the spring. The reply came 3 weeks later, and it was brief in the way that her mother's important communications were always brief. I'll be there in April. Save me a room that faces east. I've always slept better facing east. Your mother. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table and felt something release in her chest that had been there since June. Since the morning she had walked out of the church and understood she was walking away from everything familiar. She hadn't known until it released that she'd been carrying it. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket with her hands. There were things still imperfect about all of it. She understood this and did not look away from it. The legal proceedings around Consolidated Western would drag into the following year, and there would be depositions to give and documents to sign, and at least one trip to Cheyenne that she and Cade both dreaded. Crane would go to prison, and Warren would serve a shorter sentence, and the land commissioner would have a different kind of accounting in the courts, and none of it would undo the damage that had been done to the valley's ranches, or give back the months of fear and disrupted work. The informant, the person who had told the raiders about the trap, was never conclusively identified. Duff had a suspicion, but not enough to act on, and the valley had to absorb this particular unresolved thing the way communities absorb what they cannot fix, with watchful quiet and a longer memory. Amos's wariness toward her had become, over months, something she valued more than she would have expected. He was not demonstrative. He did not change in any visible surface way. But there were small things. The way he'd started leaving the morning reports on the kitchen table instead of seeking out Cade directly. The way he'd asked her opinion on the supply order twice. The way he said her name now, Eliza instead of ma'am, as if somewhere along the way she had passed a test he'd never announced he was administering. She understood that from Amos Birch, these were large gestures. Eli was a different kind of complicated. He had always been present, watchful, bright, more like his father in temperament than he knew. But after the night of the storm, something in him had settled into a different configuration. He had hit a man with a fireplace poker in the dark and scared, and then he had slept for 11 hours and woken up and eaten a large breakfast and gone out to help with the fence repairs without being asked. She had watched him and said nothing, and Cade had watched him and said nothing, and Eli had perhaps needed nothing said. What he needed, and what gradually became apparent over the following weeks, was to be given more. More responsibility, more honest conversation, more inclusion in the decisions that affected the ranch he lived on. Cade had always been a good father in the ways that mattered most, present, consistent, taking his son seriously. But there was a version of Eli he had been protecting that Eli had outgrown, and it was Eliza who said so. Not in front of Eli. In the evening, quietly, at the kitchen table. "He's not 14 anymore," she said. "I mean, he is, technically, but he's not in the way that matters. He made a choice in that room that night, and he made it correctly, and he knew the stakes when he made it. You can't unknow something like that about yourself." Cade was quiet for a moment. "He's still a boy." "He's a boy who understands what's real," she said. "That's different from just being young. I thought about this for a long time." The next morning he brought Eli into the supply discussion for the first time. He did not make a production of it. He just included him, asked his opinion on 2 items, listened to the answers. Eli's expression in that moment was something she observed from the stove and did not draw attention to. The particular expression of a person being seen clearly for the first time by someone whose opinion of them matters most. It was not a perfect family. She did not use that word even to herself, was careful with it, understood that the word carried the weight of all the ways things failed to be what you hoped. But it was real. Cade and Eli and Amos and the Dorsey brothers and the ranch and the garden and the work, all of it was real, genuinely and specifically real. The way things are real when you have put your hands into them and sweat over them and defended them. She had come to believe in the months since June that this was the only kind of life that actually worked. Not the anticipated life, not the planned one, the actual one, assembled from what you have after the plan fails, built with whoever is standing next to you in the wreckage. The second wedding happened in November, on a Thursday. It was Cade who asked, and he asked in the way he did most things, plainly, without staging, at a moment she wasn't expecting. They were walking the north fence line after the morning shooting practice, which they had continued as a regular thing long past any practical necessity, because they had both understood without saying so that Thursday mornings at the fence line were not really about shooting anymore. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if you want that." She looked at the fence line, at the hills in the distance, going brown and gold with the season, at the sky, which was the particular deep blue of a Wyoming November, a color she had come to love in the particular way you love things you were not born to. "I want that," she said. "It won't be a large affair," he said. "I don't think either of us needs a large affair." "No," she agreed. "Reverend Price and Harlow, maybe. The family and Tanner and whoever else is close." "My mother," she said. "Your mother," he agreed. "In April when she comes." She looked at him. "You'd wait until April, if that's what you need." She thought about her mother facing east in a room she hadn't slept in yet. Thought about the letter in her apron pocket and the relief it had brought. Thought about what it would mean to have her mother there. "April," she said. "April," he agreed. They walked back to the ranch in the cold morning air, not touching but close, the comfortable close of people who know each other's stride. The barn was visible in the distance. The kitchen chimney had smoke coming from it. Eli had started the stove, which he did now without being asked. The west fence ran straight and new in the morning light. She looked at all of it. Her mother arrived in April on the stage from Laramie, 3 days late because of a road washout that she described in the letter she'd sent ahead as an inconvenience and in person as a minor adventure. She was 61 years old, and she had her daughter's directness and her daughter's posture and an opinion about everything that she delivered without apology and retracted without embarrassment when she was wrong, which was less often than most people, but more often than she liked to admit. She stood in the yard of Mercer Ridge and looked at the house and the barn and the garden, coming up now, the beds full of early spring green, the trellis repaired and waiting for the climbers she'd planted in March. And she looked at Cade, and she looked at Eli, and she looked at her daughter. Then she said, "Well, this is something." "It is," Eliza said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, at the person she had become in 10 months of Wyoming and hard work and harder choices. at the particular quality of a woman who knows where she stands. You look like yourself, her mother said. More than I've seen in years. Eliza took her bag. Come inside. I made cornbread. I hate cornbread. I know. I also made apple cake. Her mother smiled. The wedding was small and took place on a Saturday in late April, with the spring running full and the hills turning the particular sharp green that Wyoming only manages for a few weeks before the summer bleaches it. Reverend Price, who was an older man with a kindly face and no interest in ceremony for its own sake, kept it brief and honest. Tanner came, red-faced and uncomfortable in a good jacket. Amos stood in the back of the room in his work clothes because he had refused to change into anything else, and nobody had pushed it. The Dorsey brothers sat together and Pete cried, which he would later deny. Eli stood beside his father. He was 15 now, taller than he'd been in June, the boy angles of his face beginning to shift toward something else. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and a quality that was entirely his own, a kind of deliberate steadiness that he had been building since the night he picked up the fireplace poker and made a choice in the dark. He looked at Eliza when she came in and said quietly, "You look good." "Thank you, Eli." "My dad's been nervous all morning," he said. "He burned the eggs." "He told me he doesn't get nervous. He tells himself that," Eli said. She was still almost smiling when she reached Cade at the front of the room. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her since the night on the porch, since the morning at the fence, openly, without the careful concealment that had been his habit. She had come to understand that being looked at this way, honestly and without performance, was the thing she had been missing in the life she'd had before. Not grand love, not sweeping gestures. Someone who looked at you and didn't look away. Price spoke. They answered. The room was warm. Somewhere outside a bird was making a persistent sound she hadn't identified yet. A spring arrival? Something new. When it was done, Cade put his hand against her face the way he had on the porch after the storm. That same specific gesture, present and certain. And then he dropped it and squeezed her hand instead, and they turned to face the room together, and the room, small as it was, made a noise that was less like applause and more like collective relief. Tanner shook Cade's hand for a long time. Amos nodded at both of them with the expression of a man who considers his opinion already known and sees no reason to repeat it. Her mother took Cade aside at the small supper afterward and spoke to him privately for 10 minutes by the window. Eliza could see the conversation happening but could not hear it. Cade listened more than he spoke, which was characteristic, and at the end of it her mother patted his arm once and came back to the table. "What did you say to him?" Eliza asked. "Things that were mine to say," her mother said. "Pass the bread." She passed the bread. It was summer when she knew about the baby. She knew before she was certain, in the way that the body communicates things before you have the language for them. And she sat with the knowledge for 3 days without telling anyone. Not from fear, not from uncertainty about what she felt. She was sitting with it in the way she had learned to sit with important things, letting it become real before she handed it to anyone else. She told Cade on a Thursday morning, "I was at the fence line." She walked out to him the way she had 100 times. He turned when he heard her coming and looked at her face, and she watched him understand before she said a word. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched what moved through him. He was not a man who showed things easily, but this he could not contain entirely. Something in his face that was older than happiness. Something from the region of being given back a thing you had stopped expecting. "Are you pes?" he began. "I'm well," she said. "I'm good." She paused. "I'm very good, actually." He nodded. He looked at the fence line and then at the hills and then at her, and she understood this was his version of needing a moment, so she gave it to him. After a while he said, "I'll need to finish the house properly before winter." "I know." "There's the upper room that's never been—" "I know," she said. "It's on the list." He almost smiled. "Of course it is." He reached for her hand and held it without saying anything else. And they stood at the north fence in the summer morning and looked at the land together. The hills rolling west, the grass going deep green with the season, the ranch behind them with its barn and its outbuildings, and the kitchen chimney, and the garden that was producing in its second year with the sureness of something that has found its roots. The upper room was finished by October. Stone and timber, with a window that faced east because she had asked for east. Cade did much of the work himself, with Pete helping and Eli underfoot in the way of a 15-year-old who wants to be useful and is learning what that actually means in practice. It was not a polished room. The corner where Pete had set the trim was slightly off, and Cade had decided it wasn't worth redoing, and Eliza had agreed. The window frame was a quarter-inch out of level. The floor had a gap near the south wall that admitted a draft they would need to deal with before winter. It was real. That was what mattered. Real rooms have imperfect corners and drafty gaps and the evidence of the hands that built them. She stood in the finished room in late October with the autumn light coming through the east window and her hand on the wall and her life against the wall and everything she had come through to be standing here, in this room, in this place, with this specific accumulation of choices and work and loss and recovery behind her. She had come here in a ruined dress. She had come with nothing that mattered but the refusal to lie down in the road and wait for something to come along and finish her. She had not known, standing in that Wyoming scrubland with the blue sky overhead and the ring in her pocket, and the future dissolved, that refusal was a kind of beginning, that the ending of a thing you thought you needed can be the only door open to the thing you actually need. She had not known that strength, in the way she understood it now, was not the absence of fear. It was fear fully present and the decision to go anyway. It was the porch in the dark, and the revolver with shaking hands, and the choice to open the door instead of bar it. She had not known that love in its real form was not the version she'd been sold, not the clean promise at an altar on a June morning. It was the ledger with margin notes, the Thursday mornings at the fence line, the hand on her face after a storm, the coffee left hot without ceremony, and the barn door fixed, and the way a man says we without examining whether you belong in it. These were the things she knew now, outside the east window. The hills were going gold and rust with the season, the aspens turned and trembling in a light wind, the sky the deep specific blue of a Wyoming October afternoon. She could hear Eli in the yard below, arguing with Pete about something structural. The boy had developed opinions about carpentry, and Amos's voice once, cutting through to end the argument efficiently. The sound of the ranch, familiar and hers. Cade came to the doorway of the room. He leaned against the frame and looked at her at the window and said nothing. "The corner's off," she said about the trim. "Half an inch," he said. "More like 3/4. You going to fix it?" "Not immediately." She looked at the corner. "I think I'll leave it for a while. Remind me it was built by human hands." He looked at the corner too. "Fair enough." She put both hands on the windowsill and looked out at the October hills and thought about April, when her mother had stood in the yard and said, "You look like yourself," in a way that had nearly broken her with its accuracy. She thought about what self that was. The self that had existed before Warren Aldgate and the altar and the ruined dress. Some essential version of her that had been present all along and had simply needed the right circumstances to show itself. Or maybe not the right circumstances. Maybe the hard ones. Maybe it had always needed the hard ones. She thought this was probably the truth of most people, that the self-worth being is forged in the difficult seasons, not the easy ones. That you find out what you're made of, not in the comfortable years, but in the ones that take something real from you and show you what's left after. What was left, in her case, was this: a ranch in Wyoming. A man who does not run from hard things. A boy learning to be a man in the daily, unremarkable way that most important things happen. A garden in its second year. A child beginning. A friendship with a taciturn ranch hand that has no word for what it is but means something real. A list in an apron pocket that is always growing and never quite finished. She was not the woman who had stood at that altar. She was the woman who had walked out of the church and into the scrubland and sat down on a rock and looked at a ring and understood that her life was not over. That it was changing shape and that the new shape was going to require something she hadn't known she had. She had found out what she had. Cade pushed off from the doorframe. "Eli's going to take that corner apart if Pete doesn't stop arguing with him," he said. "Let him," she said. "He's probably right." He laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that catches a man off guard. She had heard it more often in recent months and still valued each instance. He came and stood beside her at the east window, and they looked out at the hills together, the gold and rust of the aspens, the clean October sky, the land running out to the horizon in every direction with the particular indifference of country that was here long before any of them and would be here long after. The frontier remained what it always was, hard, beautiful, unwilling to make promises it didn't keep. The winters would come hard, and the springs would come wet, and there would be years that tested everything they had built, and years that gave back more than they'd expected. And through all of it, the work would continue. The daily specific work of a life that is real, with all its imperfect corners and drafty gaps, and the evidence of the hands that built it. She put her hand on the windowsill. He put his beside it. Outside, Eli won the argument about the corner. The wind moved through the aspens and the light shifted and the Wyoming afternoon continued, unhurried and unsentimental, in the direction of whatever came next.